Background mythos. Despite popular belief, chaos wasn't some all-powerful creator god like every betrayed Percy Jackson fanfiction ever made. In fact, it was a form of energy that predated the known universe, the source from which all beings belonging to the divine side of the world gain their power from. This is because it was the acts of the protogonoi primordial, bringing order to said chaos that granted them their power. For example, it was the coming of the existence of Nyx Nox who brought order to chaos, becoming the embodiment of the night that began the Greco-Roman creation story. By making use of chaos, Nyx created herself a husband named Erebus, who became the embodiment of darkness and mist, also accredited as the forever expanding walls of the underworld and Tartarus. From their union, came their protogonoi children Hermera the day, Dies Ether the light, or the upper air that the gods breath, and Ocles the misery. Their daimon children, beings that are said to be somewhere between immortals and mortals in power and usually embody feelings, environments, or concepts included Thanatos, the Reaper, Hypnos, the Sleeper, Geras, the Aging, Charon the Guider, and Elpis, the Hopeful, as well as a couple of lesser daimons. And their titanic and godly children, Eris, the Chaotic, and Nemesis, the Vengeful. Separate from the line Nyx came the line of Ananke the Inevitable and Kronos the Eternal. And despite being the embodiments of some of the most potent and essential domains in the Greco-Roman pantheon, neither play a significant role in the mythos and have since remained dormant long before the fall of Ouranos and the rise of the gods. Finally, we come to the most crucial line of the protogonoi, the line Gaia, the Earth Mother Terra, the embodiment of the land all life springs from, and the accredited progenitor of the Olympians and Titans. Gaia sprung to life, separated from her fellow protogonoi. Like her sister Nyx, she used chaos to create her elder and only protogonoi children, Ouranos, the Sky Father, Tartarus the Abyss, and Ore, the Mountains. All three of Gaia's male children harbored romantic feelings for her, but it was Ouranos who earned the honor of being her husband, and she proclaimed him king of the cosmos. The Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, and the elder Cyclops, embodiments of sea, earth, and sky, came from this union. Ouranos hated these misshapen and monstrous children and thus forced them into his brother Tartarus's domain. He then lay with Gaia again, this time producing the first generation of Titans, Oceanus, he who girdles the world, Koios the thoughtful, Krios the gazer, Hyperion, the bright, Iapetus the piercer, Dia the splendor, Tethys the mother of waters, Themis the lawful, Phoebe the prophet, Mnemosyne the lady of remembrance, Rhea the mother, and last but not least Kronos the crooked one. The combined efforts of the male elder Titans bar Oceanus, aided by Gaia's cunning, would see the fall of Ouranos. After the Skyfather's fall, aided by the jagged scythe created by Gaia, Kronos would become the undisputed king of the cosmos. They are ushering in a new age of immortals ruling from Mount Orthes, the seat of Ouranos' fall. This age would be known as the Golden Age, and would bring a prosperous era for the immortals, creating a new assortment of deities. From the line of Hyperion and Thea would come Eos the dawn, Helios the sun, and Selene the moon. Before the modern age, Helios and Selene drove the celestial bodies via chariots across the sky, creating the day and night cycle. It is unknown whether they were titanic beings or closer to the protogonoi, acting more like the embodiments of the domains they inhabit rather than manipulators like Titan family members. From the line of Iapetus and Kilmon, one of the many Oceanid children of Oceanus and Tethys and derives her name from fame, came Atlas he who endures, Menoetius the filled, Epimetheus the thoughtless, and Prometheus thoughtful. In Greek mythology, Atlas was made to endure the sky burden after the fall of the Titans. This would lead to him being accredited as the endurable due to his ability to hold the weight of a protogonoi. He is also responsible for fathering the Hesperides and Zoe Nightshade with the sea goddess Pleione. Epimetheus is seen as the opposite of his brother Prometheus, often making decisions without thinking ahead, constantly leading him into trouble, causing him to be seen as the Titan god of afterthought. Epimetheus gave away all God's gifts to the animals during the creation of humanity, leaving nothing for humans. He led his brother Prometheus to steal the fire from Athena and Hephaestus's forge, causing him to be imprisoned by Zeus. Epimetheus later married Pandora and was one of the few beings to survive the end of the world by Poseidon's trident with his wife. From the line of Koios and Phoebe came Asteria the dreamer, Leto, the protector of the young, and Lelantos, the unseen hunter. Leto would go on to be seduced by Zeus and give birth to Apollo and Artemis, who coincidentally gained domains similar to their aunt and uncle. From the line of Krios and Eurybia, a minor goddess believed to be a result of an affair between Pontus and Gaia, giving her a little mastery over the sea, came Astraeus the astrologist, Perseus the destroyer, and Pallas the warcraft. In one mythological version, Athena slays Pallas, choosing to bear his name as a medal of honor. One of the most prominent family lines are Oceanus and Tethys, who are titled the father and mother of waters for a reason. They would be responsible for parenting the Oceanids, daughters of the ocean, and the Potamoi, the river gods, the most important of these children being Styx the Oathkeeper, Métis the Counselor, Acheron the Punisher, Phlegethon the Restorer, and Cocytus the Wailer. Oceanus and Tethys would also be responsible for being the grandparents of the Nereids, minor sea goddess, especially Amphitrite, the future wife of Poseidon and queen of Atlantis. The last of the elder Titan lines fall upon Kronos and Rhea. It is stated that Rhea was by far the most beautiful of the Titaness, bearing a close resemblance to her mother, Gaia. Her beauty was so great that Kronos disregarded the curse placed upon him by Ouranos and chose to marry her. This decision would prove to his downfall, however, as when Rhea gave birth to their first child, Hestia the Hearth. She was far more powerful and beautiful than normal Titan children. Realizing he and his wife had created a new breed of immortal, fearing an uprising, Kronos devoured his daughter to avoid such a fate. Rhea would bear Kronos 5 more children after Hestia: Demeter the Harvester, Hera the Queen of the Heavens, the Lord of the Dead, Poseidon the Sea King, and Zeus, God of Gods. All but Zeus would be devoured by Kronos, who would be ticked by Rhea with the aid of Gaia, who had grown sick of Kronos' tyranny, using the mist to make Kronos believe a rock was Zeus. Gaia and Rhea would hide away from Zeus on Crete, where he would be raised by a nymph named Amalthea, who he would later skin to create Aegis. He would learn to control his powers before, with the aid of Métis, Zeus tricked Kronos into throwing up his siblings, who would escape back to Crete and ferment rebellion. Beginning by freeing the Hecatoncheires and elder Cyclops from Tartarus by defeating the monstrous creature Camp, a monster even the Titans feared, the elder Cyclops Brontes would forge the Big Three, their symbols of power for Hades. They developed a helm made of Stygian iron that allowed him to blend into the shadows and invoke one of his greatest fears, giving Hades the title of the Silent One. For Poseidon, the Cyclops used their powers over the sea and earth to create a trident capable of generating earthquakes and summon storms, giving him the title the Earthshaker and Stormbringer. Finally, the Cyclops gave Zeus the Master Bolt, the most potent weapon in the cosmos, forged using the Cyclops' connection with Ouranos. The bolt gave Zeus the ability to control and manipulate Ouranos' lightning. With the combined might of the elder gods as well as traitorous titans such as Hecate, Helios, and Styx, as well as Oceanus' neutrality due to his granddaughter's marriage to Poseidon, the Titans were overthrown, with most of the Titans being cast into Tartarus. At the same time, Kronos was cut into pieces by his scythe by Zeus before having his essence scattered into Tartarus, so he could never reform. After destroying Orthes and forcing Atlas under the sky burden, the Cyclops erected grand palaces for each elder god on Mount Olympus, from which the Olympians gained their name. The Big Three then divided the world, with Zeus gaining the heavens, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld. It was then a new age of immortals began, the age of the gods, from which a new generation of gods began. Zeus had many children with multiple partners, his most notable being his immortal children Athena the Wise One, with Métis, Persephone the Dread Queen, with Demeter, Ares the War, Enyo the Bloodthirsty, and Hebe the Innocent, with Hera. Artemis the Huntress, and Apollo the Golden, with Leto. Hermes as the messenger, with Maia, Clotho as the birther, Lachesis as the life-giver, and Atropos as the death-bringer, with Themis. Dionysus the mad god, born from Semele. Poseidon was a god quick to anger and rarely forgave, like Zeus, who saw the oaths made in marriage as worthless than the printed paper. However, unlike Zeus, Poseidon's immortal children were relatively unremarkable compared to their Olympian cousins. There was Triton, the sea messenger, as well as Chimapolia, the violent storm, with his lawful wife Amphitrite, Arion, the fastest land being, with Demeter, Pegasus, the winged one, and Chrysaor, the golden sword, with Medusa. Hades, unlike his younger brothers, was just dutiful and rarely, if ever, left the confines of his marriage to Persephone. This led to him having a few immortal children, they being Melino the soul-seeker, Macaria the blesser of death, and Zagreus the dead god could be the unconsenting child of Zeus. The only major child of any of Cronids' daughters is Hephaestus the forger, the imperfect child of Hera, who was tossed from Olympus by the queen of the heavens due to his imperfections. Aphrodite, the Lady of Doves, is the only member of the Olympian Council of Gods not directly connected to the Cronid children. Instead, she was born from where Ouranos' genitals were tossed into Thalassa, creating sea foam from which Aphrodite came. Aphrodite was the most beautiful being alive, taking the form of one's vision of beauty. When she arrived on Olympus, all the gods fought for her hand. As the goddess of marriage, Hera influenced Zeus into marrying Aphrodite off to Hephaestus, believing this would quell the interest in Aphrodite. Instead, all it did was lead to an unhappy marriage, with Aphrodite having multiple affairs with gods and mortals alike. Some of her immortal children are Eros, the love-bringer, Deimos the dread, and Phobos, the fear, with Ares. Tyche the fortunate, with Hermes. Rode the island, with Poseidon. Titans, to a lesser degree than the gods, wield considerable strength when manipulating their domains. Still, for what they lack in control and raw power, they make up for in physical and metaphysical strength, with most of the elder Titans and Atlas being far more substantial than the average god, with only more physically imposing deities like the Big Three, Ares and Heracles, being capable of matching them. On the other hand, the Protogonoi eclipses both in strength and power. However, they are far more accountable to the ancient laws and can be forced into deep slumber when forced from their domain. Felt the need to include my version of the mythos, not only so when you see me mention something that didn't happen in PJO you know why, but also just as something I can reference instead of having to keep going to the wiki or remembering of the top of my head. The Greek Mythosguru creator's thoughts. 3 comments 0 vote. Domain explanations. King of the Underworld. Being the ruler of the Underworld allows Hades free will on how the Underworld operates and the ability to determine its terrain and infrastructure. It also will enable Hades to rule over all beings related to the Underworld, allowing him to strip those who are disloyal or need punishment of their divinity if it is related to his nature or relies on his realm. This is the same authority both Poseidon and Zeus have over their territories. This also means Hades is the only one capable of granting domains related to the Underworld, making him capable of giving godhood to those he chooses. Because the walls of the Underworld are made up of Erebus, the Protogonoi of darkness and mist, Hades is given some control over shadows and darkness. This ability is strengthened when he is within the Underworld itself. God of the dead. As the Greco-Roman Lord of the Dead, Hades has complete control and dominion not only over the dead. This does not make him the god of death, so he is not the bringer of death but rather the one in charge of determining one's destination once they have arrived in the Underworld. Hades has free reign in deciding where someone gets placed as well as what their punishment will be. This also allows Hades to revive the dead. However, it isn't something he would do lightly as it is seen as an insult to his domain. This also causes Hades to give off an aura of death that is found eerie and terrifying for not only mortals but also immortals due to the fact it is something they, as immortal beings, should not be able to experience. This has led to most immortals find being in Hades' presence uncomfortable and leads them to be distrusting. Hades also has substantial control over one's soul and can even manipulate the souls of lesser immortals. God of riches. Hades is granted dominion over all the precious metals beneath the earth. This gives him excellent material wealth and makes him the one people pray to when hoping for riches. This domain also allows Hades to manipulate those seeking material wealth for his gain. Those of great wealth will pray to Hades to maintain their great fortune. This has earned Hades the moniker the Rich One. This domain also grants Hades a measure of control over the earth, specifically minerals and hard metals. God of divination. This divinity grants Hades a measured view of past, present, and possible future events. Being one of the few beings capable of affecting and viewing fate gives Hades a power that most gods respect and fear while maintaining their envy. Unlike his nephew Phoebus Apollo or his nieces, the Moirai, Hades cannot directly affect fate's strings but views their possible outcomes and manipulates them to suit his needs. This power has also made Hades some people seeking ways of avoiding their perilous fates pray for guidance, hoping that Hades' good counsel will help them in their choices. This allows Hades to predict other people's actions and moves, making him a very infuriating person to fight even for an immortal fellow. God of forbidden knowledge. Being the deity responsible for holding forbidden knowledge, Hades is seen as a holder of both helpful and destructive expertise. Hades is known for using the allure of forbidden knowledge to lure people into servitude. Is not only knowledge like lost magics and rituals part of Hades' domain but also any secrets or plots that may be occurring. This has led to Hades being prayed to by rulers and politicians in hopes of uncovering plots. Hades' domain over forbidden knowledge has led him to be considered one of the wisest of the gods and often seen as the patron of secrets. Just a brief explanation on how Hades' domains work and what sort of powers and responsibilities that come with them. The Greek Mythosguru creator's thoughts. 7 comments 0 vote. And vote. I've seen a couple of people asking who I am going to choose as a pairing, and the only decision I could come to is that it would be a single pairing, but deciding who it would be is where I am struggling, so I am just gonna list a bunch of potential options and let people vote. Persephone the Dread Queen. Despite popular belief Persephone isn't the goddess of the spring, rather this was a title bestowed upon her because Persephone, returned from the underworld, symbolized the lessening of Demeter, wrath, leading to the ending of winter and the coming of spring. There are some versions of the mythos having Persephone predating Hades as a ruler of the underworld by at least 1,000 years and giving credit to the belief that the creation of Hades was most likely used as a way to make all the big three male. Persephone also has a lot of stories of her passing judgment on mortals she either favored or hated. Persephone, unlike Hades, was ruled by her emotions, often making her capable of acting without thinking and being capable of being manipulated. This made people who sought something from the underworld only making their attempts when Persephone was present. Persephone was an exceedingly gorgeous goddess. She was so beautiful her mother Demeter would hide her away from Olympus in fear of her fellow gods' reaction to it. Described as having the form of a tall young woman with an beautiful but pale face, her hair was dark and long that curled and flowed as if it was weightless. When within the underworld her eyes took the color of undying flower and held a haunted quality, whilst when in the overworld they shone with a healthy green glow like a flower during the bloom of spring. Hecate, the queen of witches. The daughter of the titans Perseus and Asteria, Hecate was the titan goddess of magic, the mist, crossroads, necromancy, the night and moon. Often depicted as wearing a flowing black gown and surrounded by her familia, Hecate has two physical depictions. In ancient times she was depicted carrying twin torches burning with a green hellish flame, whilst having 3 heads each depicting the morning, noon and night. In modern times Hecate is described as having glowing green eyes that swirled with power, luscious dark hair that barely came to her shoulders. Her face was the vision of a goddess beauty with alluring pale skin and features described as being ageless. And surrounded with a greenish aura that radiated strength. Nemesis the vengeful. A daughter of Nyx and Erebus, Nemesis is the goddess of balance, retribution and vengeance. When viewed by immortals, Nemesis has short, curly black hair and eyes that burnt with molten gold. However, to mortal eyes she appears as however they wish to take vengeance on. Styx the Oathkeeper. One of the many daughters of Oceanus and Tethys, an embodiment of one of the 5 rivers of the underworld. Styx is symbolized as the keeper of oaths and also a giver of the curse of the river Styx, granting the bear near invulnerability if mortal. Styx cannot leave the boundaries of her river and similar to her protogonoi grandparents takes a form that is effected by her domain, with ebony long hair that wafted in the currents of her river, with sublime features that are shrouded with the waters of the Styx. Her eyes were holes of obsidian that radiated authority. During the Titanomachy, Styx betrayed her husband Pallas and sided with the gods, giving her children Zealous the zeal, Nike the victorious, Bia the force and Kratos the strength to be Zeus on her guard. Other. Just a couple of pairing options and background info on what they will look and possibly act like if chosen. The Greek Mythosguru creators' thoughts. 42 comments, 0 vote. The ancient laws explanation. During the time before both the titans of Mount Orthes and gods of Mount Olympus existed, the age of the protogonoi, an age filled with war and chaos, an age where the wrath of the protogonoi was unrestricted, an age where something as little as a petty insult could lead to battle across the cosmos. These wars between the protogonoi created a series of rules and regulations that would be forever known as the ancient laws. The ancient laws were created to limit the conflicts between the protogonoi over the cosmos, as a way to bind them to their realms and avoid all-out war. This is why the first, only, and most important of the ancient laws created by the protogonoi is that no immortal can enter another's domain without first being granted entry. This law ensured the protogonoi could not cross between each other's realms to bring conflict. When the protogonoi entered dormancy, this law fell upon their titan and god descendants. When Kronos overthrew his father Oranos, he became the protector of the ancient laws to ensure the safety of his most prized artifact gifted to him by his mother Gaia, his jagged scythe. He declared that no immortal could steal another's symbol of power. This law made it so that only through mortal interference could a symbol of power be stolen. After the fall of Mount Olympus and the rise of Olympus, it was Zeus who began to enforce the ancient laws. Still, it wouldn't be until the arrival of humanity that he would make any additions to the laws, the first of which is that for an immortal to be able to fight a demigod, they must first be challenged. This ensured that gods could not fully interfere in a demigod's destiny. After the fall of Rome, Zeus decreed that Olympus would shut itself off to humanity, so he created the law limiting how much the gods could interfere with mortal affairs. This law would ensure that gods could not directly interfere in their dead children's lives. Overall, the effects and power of the ancient laws depend entirely on the one who created said laws. For example, the laws made by the protogonoi are much stronger than those made by Zeus, as well as the power of the one who enforces them. This is why certain immortals like powerful gods or titans and protogonoi can avoid punishment from some of the laws, such as attacking a demigod without being challenged or interfering with the mortal world. Where a saws such as no immortal can enter another's domain without first being granted entry or enforced harshly due to the power of the protogonoi behind them. Just a quick summary on how the Ansonet laws are gonna function in this story. The Greek Mythosguru creators' thoughts. 1 comments 0 vote. Power rankings. 1. Eldest of the protogonoi, Nyx, Ananke and Kronos. 2. The younger earthly protogonoi, Oranos, Pontus, Tartarus, Ether, Gaia and Hemera. 3. The supreme gods. Zeus, Hades my version Kronos, Fates and Typhon. 4. Elder gods. Poseidon, Hades Og version Porphyrion, Athena, Oceanus and Helios. 5. Higher level gods. Apollo, Hecate, Demeter, Hera, Aphrodite and Atlas. 6. Mid-level gods. Artemis, Hermes, Hephaestus, Hyperion, Hestia and Ares during war. 7. Lower-level gods. Ares no war Dionysus and Heracles. 8. Low-level gods. Triton, Nike, Nemesis and Percy Jackson. 9. High demigod level. Jason Grace, Nico D'Angelo, Talia Grace, Zoe Nightshade and Luke Castellan. 10. Mid-demigod level. Annabeth Chase, Reina Ramirez Arellano and Clarice LaRue. Just a quick power ranking for me to come back to when working out fights. The Greek Mythosguru creators' thoughts. 11 comments 0 vote. I accidentally spent eternity in the void. Unknown Pav. With a start, I awoke within the inky black void where I had spent what felt like an eternity meandering. To a sound that I could only describe to someone who had not heard it as the sound of 1,000 dying stars exploding as one grand celebration for the end of the universe. Startled, I began to quickly analyze my surroundings in search of the noise that indeed would have ruptured my eardrums if I was still amongst the living, only to see no change in the void devoid of no light. There was no great light or fire, only the same view that had been plaguing me since my soul found itself lost in this damn place. Colorless walls seemed to drain the light out of the room, combined with an inky gray smog that made viewing anything beyond a few feet impossible. It was just my luck getting trapped in an empty void all of the time, perfectly fitting when you consider the bad luck that followed me through life, to begin with, so why not top it all off by ensuring my afterlife is spent doing the cosmic equivalent of watching paint dry? I could think of nothing more suitable. After all, why throw me in hell when one can become desensitized to pain instead? Why not just throw me into a bottomless hole of nothingness? Yes, that sounds far more bleak and painful than torture, having to withstand the gaping hole of loneliness for an eternity. Whatever cosmic entity came up with that idea indeed must be praising their brilliance if they can even be bothered coming up with such an idea themselves, especially for such an insignificant mortal such as I. Although I must admit, I wonder if this is just how it is for everyone. If there truly is no great beyond, no golden city in the sky or fiery pit of death beneath the earth, it would be quite the thing if no religion was correct. No reincarnation or afterlife, no gods or demons, just lost souls passing through the empty black voids of creation destined for nothingness for all time. It was being lost in these dreary thoughts, which happened quite often when one has nothing to do but get lost in one bitterness, that I failed to notice a crack like shattered glass forming in the void behind me, at least until a cough for attention was heard. I say cough because that is all that my mortal mind can comprehend it as, because it sounded far more like a whisper spoken in an ancient tongue long forgotten by time, indecipherable and unrepeatable, and could only be understood due to the weight and intent behind it. As I spun around remarkably quickly for a being with no actual physical form, my eyes fell upon what must have been the most average-looking person I have ever seen. No galaxies were spinning in his eyes, clouds didn't hang from his beard, and he certainly didn't have shiny silver hair. No, instead, he had short brown hair, which I would describe as getting the best value for your money at the barber's, dull blue eyes that held no visible twinkle or ancient wisdom, a nose that was slightly upturned but not enough to be unique, ears that were neither too big nor too short, as well as a light stubble to dust of his remarkably plain face. He looked unremarkable. If you asked someone to draw a human, you would get your basic John Doe, one of the many organic robots that populate Earth in the millions. Yet, when I gazed upon him, every instinct went off like a warning sign. Something deep within me understood that this was no ordinary John Doe, no common man. No, this was something far more, something beyond mortal comprehension. Even now, after spending what felt like forever inside the void, after spending so long removed from the mortal coil, I still could not even begin to fathom the meaning of this being. Shook from my thoughts, I forced my way through the paralyzing force fixed on my significant being, preventing me from making any moves, a primal reaction that has existed in mortals since their creation. I watched as the being quizzically gazed upon me for the first time since noticing the man. An emotion entered his eyes, an emotion that wasn't quite confusing but more along the line of bemusement, like coming home from work to find your pillows had been torn by your pet. However quickly the emotion entered his eyes, it left twice as fast, and what was left behind was apathy, like lifting your boot to realize you had crushed some ants. A whisper spoken by the entity that, while impossible to hear, shook my very existence as if it had been shouted from the top of its lungs passed through me before a false smile that neither revealed teeth nor created any dimples lit up the being face, a false smile that one would wear like a mask to hide more genuine emotions. Suddenly, the cracks that the entity entry had created began to seal like skin knitting itself back together after being torn, the entity itself around to turn to smoke as its essence was absorbed back into the quickly closing wound on the wall before all that was left was pasty white vapor, which smelled like garlic. This, of course, should have been impossible as I was a celestial being and thus had no nose or senses, so for me to be able to smell anything spoke of the smell's supernatural nature. The vapor itself began to form into a worn scroll that opened itself just close enough to view but still protected from my touch by the black smog that plagued the void. As the scroll finally formed and unraveled, it began to draw the darkness on the walls, tuning into ink that danced upon the scroll, fitting through languages, none of which were recognizable before finally settling on English. World. Wishes. 1, 2, 3. Recently got back into Greek mythology with the new Percy Jackson TV show coming out, so tried to create at least an intriguing start to a goddess in the PJO universe. Feel free to leave any suggestions for wishes. The Greek MythosGuru creator's thoughts. 5 comments 0 vote. The one where a choice is made. Unknown Pav. Now, while I would love to tell you how, as soon as I read those words, my mind began to explode with ideas on how to minimize these wishes to the best of my ability. The truth of the matter is that due to how cliché this whole situation was, my mind melted. Well, not literally, after all, it is impossible to melt something which doesn't exist. Turns out being a celestial being does have its benefits. After finally recovering from what I can only describe as my mind melting, I began to root my memories, searching for worlds and universes that once only existed in the minds of authors and scriptwriters in my previous life. Now, however, their existence lay entirely on whether or not I chose to reincarnate into them. The endless possibilities spanned through my mind, overwhelming me. After all, how was I to choose? I could be a Kryptonian in Marvel, a Saiyan in DC, or even a shinobi in Avatar. All of these countless choices left my non-existent aching somehow. I decided that the only way I would ever make my choice was by filtering out worlds based on my desires. I began by instantly removing any Dark Souls worlds from my selection, with no need to get caught up in that mess. I then decided to remove both the DC and Marvel universes, respectively, due to the uncountable amount of nigh omnipotent beings that made up for all of the great powers and resources that both universes would have granted me. As I went along eliminating worlds, I was reminded of a book series that I read when I was younger, a famous tale of a boy's deep dive into the world of mythology, reliving experiences of legends once thought false in the eyes of most, whether it be Greek, Norse or Egyptian mythology. This world would allow me to not only build up a stable power base but had an assortment of characters that I could choose to reincarnate into that would give me a good boost to my strength, more specifically, the gods. So, after staring blankly at the scroll for a few minutes with no changes occurring, it wasn't until I was about to begin panicking that the scroll once again began to draw ink from the walls to write out. World selected PJO universe, Greco-Roman mythology only. Now, you may wonder why I chose only to include the Greek and Roman mythologies. I want to say I did it because I didn't want to have to share my divinity with another being, never mind someone from a completely separate pantheon. The truth is I knew I would struggle to remember the names and domains of the gods in my pantheon, never mind accidentally offending several nigh omnipotent beings due to forgetting about them, so I decided only to include Greco-Roman mythology. My first wish was pretty easy to decide, at least in theory. After all, there was no way I would allow who I was reincarnated to be a surprise. I would hate to have gone through all this thought only to be reincarnated as a demigod son of Iris. No, that would be most unfortunate. So I began to ponder on which god I would choose to be reborn as I narrowed it down to Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, and Apollo. This may seem obvious, but there are a lot of gods in Greco-Roman mythology with a lot of potential like Ares, Hephaestus, and Hermes. Even some of the minor or less critical gods like Hecate or Nike had a lot of room for growth. Still, these 4 gods were not only the most potent gods on their own, but I always felt that they could have grown even stronger if they focused more on securing their strength and domains rather than sating their egos and lusts. Now, from these 4, Zeus was the first to be eliminated. To fulfill his role in the mythos, I would have to be very charismatic and outgoing, willing to make harsh and downright cruel decisions made not only on my enemies but also on my kin. Something which my mortal self was not yet ready to consider, especially when you consider that Zeus was responsible for the birth of a lot of significant deities, but also how said deities were born. So Zeus was out. Next was Apollo. While he may have had the most potential of these options, at least when compared to his canon counterpart, I faced similar problems that I had when considering Zeus. He was too outgoing and charismatic and responsible for a lot of important events, both cruel and significant alike, and while I was sure I could have probably been capable of such events, I would lack a domain like the traditional Big Three that would see me protected by the ancient laws from trespassers and invaders. Thus, Apollo was also out. After a long deliberation, I finally decided to remove Poseidon. Admittedly, this took as long as it did because I think Poseidon has the coolest domains and titles. Also, my personal favorite god in the original canon was just a less powerful, more wrathful version of Zeus, at least until canon. I would also have to deal with being the creator of creatures such as the Minotaur and the Gorgon sisters, and while I could maybe make these stories less tragic, fate in the PJO universe always came to pass one way or another. So that left only one option left. Hades, probably one of the most misunderstood characters in media, vilified as the Greek mythological version of the devil. In truth, out of all the gods, Hades is one of the better. After all, there's a reason he was entitled to the hospitable one. He did his duty and ruled the underworld pretty somewhat, especially when you consider it was pretty much a prison made to keep him from Olympus, and even though he's so prevalent in modern mythos, he isn't that relevant when you consider the other deities. This is mainly because he was confined to the underworld for a majority of the Greek mythos, and thus unlike the other gods didn't have the time to create hordes of monstrous beings. He was also one of the few faithful deities to his spouse. Hades even allowed Orpheus to save his wife from the underworld despite the fact that he had no reason to. Overall, Hades was pretty chill. Combine that with the fact he ruled over the Greco-Roman afterlife in its entirety, as unlike in Norse or biblical mythos, in Greco-Roman mythos, there was no Valhalla or heaven for the gods favored. He also ruled over all the metal that existed beneath the earth, granting him the name the Rich One. And considering the way most gods are kidnapping your niece and forcing her to marry you, it is pretty tame in the grand scheme of things. Of course, Hades and I share a lot of our personality traits. We both feel incredibly bitter about the hand fate dealt us and spend all our days sulking and moaning about it. We are both hardcore introverts, so he was the obvious choice with everything said and done. Wish 1 selected. Reborn as Adonis, Hades. With my future self selected, it was time to choose my final 2 wishes, which were a lot harder than expected as I needed a way to increase my power in a way that wasn't either too powerful or too weak. As if I came out of Ray's womb exploding with power, there's no way Kronos wouldn't just cut me to ribbons like Oranos, never mind what effect Zeus' paranoia or Poseidon's jealousy would have in the future. Thus I decided to add some additional domains that would grow stronger with time and could be excused as being natural. Wish 2 selected. Domain added divination, the art of predicting or viewing the future. Wish 3 selected. Domain added forbidden knowledge, all knowledge considered taboo or forgotten. I'll be honest. I struggled with developing some domains that would make sense and not be questionable for the Lord of the Dead. Still, I'm quite proud of these as they are already pretty powerful but are not something that will give me an immediate power boost. Rather, something that I can learn to control can become very powerful, especially when you consider how important fate is within the PJO universe and how powerful the beings who can manage or view fate are. Furthermore, the amount of knowledge of godly artifacts, curses, or locations lost by time or forbidden that could be discovered with my domain of banned knowledge is invaluable, especially when it has the potential to alert me to plots or schemes that may be happening around me. As the last letter was formed on the scroll in front of me confirming my wishes, for the first time since I had found my way into the void, a bright light filled the space, growing from the size of a cheap hand-powered torch until it bathed the room in the light, once again obscuring the view of my surroundings, although this time for a completely different reason. Drawing me in like the force that first brought me to the void, bathing me in scalding hot heat that seemed to boil my very essence, and with a flash, the light was gone and me with it. Ready to begin my new life as Hades, King of the Underworld, Lord of the Dead, the Rich, the Silent, the Hospitable, God of the Dead, Riches, Divination, and Forbidden Knowledge. 11 comments, 0 vote. Congratulations. It's a god. Hades Pav. While I would love to lie and tell you that having your entire essence destroyed and remodeled so that it can be suitable for becoming an immortal soul, the truth of the matter is that it was by far the most painful experience of my entire life. The easiest way to describe it is like having your soul scooped out of your body by a spoon before being trapped inside the center of the sun while having hot oil poured over it repeatedly, and even that would have probably been tamer and less painful than what I went through. I would go as far as to say that if I hadn't spent so long trapped in an empty void, I would have probably gone insane if I wasn't already. It was all bad after all. In fact, I would go as far to say it was essential considering the alternative was to be reborn as a mortal version of Hades, which, as you can imagine, would be pretty bad, like not surviving the plunge down Kronos gullet bad. Although, it was a bit disconcerting having your soul stretched and expanded, making room for new parts and pieces while having your old parts born out when it was decided they weren't needed. I must admit, though, that the vast feeling of potential and growth felt in the process's wake was a great feeling, almost as excellent as when my domains finally began to enter the depths of my soul. It's tough to explain to someone who has never felt it before. Still, the feeling of correctness that flowed through my very being was incredible knowledge of subjects that would have once been impossible for a mortal to understand, knowledge of the intricacies of death and the afterlife, knowledge that would have been overwhelming and mind-breaking for my previous mortal self, now felt as easy to understand and recall in my head as basic math. Images of events yet to come flickered through my mind like they were searching for the right channel, hardly staying long enough to be understood, eyes of swirling green and gold pulsing with power, like looking into the eye of a storm. In contrast, indistinguishable voices chanted, flickering through emotions so quickly that even my newly immortal soul struggled to keep up with it before I could even begin comprehending what I had just witnessed. The images stopped taking the voices with them. Once again, a bright light filled my vision, all I could see was darkness. When my eyes finally adjusted to the lack of light, I began to scan my surroundings only to discover that I once again had found myself trapped inside an empty, void-like space. However, where the walls of my previous prison were pitch black and almost invisible, these walls were like flowing molten gold that danced with power and energy that seemed to respond to my very being surrounding me like it was attempting to hug me and give me warmth. It was through deduction that I decided that I must have been inside my new mother's womb. Now, I'll admit that discovery did send me reeling for a moment before I decided to roll with it. After all, in a concise amount of time, I had gone from being trapped inside an endless void to being reincarnated into a book I read as a kid, into a god once believed to be false, so finding out I was inside my new mother's womb was pretty tame considering all that I had just been through. It was once I settled down that I realized I was still in my soul form, only where before I was just about as large and bright as your typical light bulb, now I was as large and bright as a star with the very air inside this small pocket being heated up creating mirages around where the void and I met. While I began to wonder if I should try and make a physical form, I realized I had no idea where to start with that. It turns out living life as the average Joe didn't give you the correct life skills to become a mighty immortal being. So that was how I spent what must have been a couple of months, but could have admittedly been any number of times pondering thoughts like that and attempting to make any progress I could, which sadly wasn't much as it turns out there is no ingrained godly handbook to guide me. As while I did find ways to tap into my divinity, the energy itself was very narrow-minded and always tried to lead itself into a path of its own. I assumed this was my divinity attempting to access my domains as like a go-to response towards me using this energy, maybe a reason why gods are restricted to powers within the domains they represent. My experimentations ended when I began to feel a steady pull that gradually grew stronger until I felt myself being pulled forward until I met the molten gold walls of my inhabitants. Instead of stopping and crashing as one would expect, the pull weakened. I began to slow down as my essence was slowly pushed out and through the walls while the molten gold of the walls attempted to cling to me, likely aware of what fate awaited me beyond its protection. With one last tug and a pop, the hold the walls kept on me was loosened, and I was forced from the safety of its walls and into warm and soothing hands. When I looked up, I saw what must have been the most beautiful woman in existence. She was tall, maybe 7 feet if I was to guess, with dark curly hair that swept across her shoulders, eyes that seemed to glow with an earthly green like looking at the grass of a meadow during summer and a smile that shone brighter than any star even more colorful than my divine soul that she held within her hands with a look of love and wonder that only a goddess of motherhood could have, especially when you consider at this point I'm just a gleaming ball of light. However, before she could even say anything to me, I was ripped from her hands by a pair of excellent, almost claw-like hands that radiated strength, unlike Ray's hands, which were smooth and soothing like a princess's hands. These hands held calluses that should have been impossible for an immortal to gain, topped off with sharp pointy nails that were tinted yellow. I felt like I was trying to lie on a rock-hard floor, at least until the owner of these hands came into view standing at a staggering 9 to 10 feet tall that felt even taller with untamable black curly hair, and an unnerving sharp pointy beard that made him look like every cliché villain ever. However, the eyes that alerted me to who it was I was in the hold of, Kronos, with brutal molten gold eyes that sang with malice and apathy. These eyes bit harshly into my very soul, I was sure that if I were immortal, merely looking into those eyes would have been enough to die from shock. However, luckily enough for me, my immortal soul would not allow me to pass in such a humiliating way, and thus I was stuck just gazing deeply into those cruel eyes. At least until an eerie smirk lit up the creature's face before an aura of bright gold energy expanded from the belly of the monster, wrapping around me in a crushing hold with a heavy, oppressive aura strangling any thoughts or feelings I may have had, filling me only with unbearable pain and hatred, until with a great tug I once again was welcomed into darkness. 7 comments 0 vote. I plunged to my torment. Hades POV. I'll be honest. I didn't know what to expect when it came to being devoured by my father. But being strangled by a bright gold glow before being sucked into his belly button wasn't even close to what I was imagining. Although to be fair, it did make more sense than Kronos slowly taking bites out of me until I was small enough for him to swallow. Gods may be unkillable, but that experience would probably send me straight to Tartarus to reform. Not that I could have done much anyway if I had known, even if by some miracle my meager control and knowledge of my divinity was able to overpower Kronos' control, he would have probably gone straight to plan B and started peeling me up with his scythe. So, in the end, it was maybe for the best that I couldn't put up much of a fight. I don't want dear old daddy to think I was the main threat to his rule. After all, I assume his twisted love for Rhea is the only thing keeping him from using his scythe on us. And if he knew how powerful we gods could become, I don't even think that would be enough to stop him. As for my new home, chaos knows how long it will be. My mother, Ray's womb, was warm and comforting, but being inside the belly of the king cannibal was a whole new can of worms. The walls flowed with a similar molten gold. However, these walls sang with an aura of malice and hunger that was almost suffocating, coating my very essence in an attempt to destroy me. It was only due to my previous experiences that I was able even to keep hold of my sanity, and I was sure that if I were anything less than a newborn elder god, I would have probably been destroyed due to the pain. Thankfully, I was the eldest son of the most influential children of Oranos and Gaia, and thus, it would take far more than my father's particularly ravenous hunger to send me to Tartarus. Once I was finally able to blank out the near-constant pain due to my father's constant attempts on my life, I was able to do a quick check on my divinity to make sure my recent visit through my father's digestion system hadn't damaged it in any way. Thankfully, while being inside the Titan Lord's stomach did disrupt any attempt at accessing and manipulating my domain, most likely done to ensure me and my siblings couldn't just flash out, my divinity wasn't damaged in any way, just suppressed. Unfortunately, while there were some benefits to my father's stomach not resembling an actual stomach, such as not having to swim or live in my own father's stomach acid, it did mean that me and my siblings couldn't interact with each other. Even if we could, I can't imagine the conversations would be very riveting either. After all, unlike me, my siblings are newly born. While I assume immortal children age and act differently from mortal children, they still would not know common aspects of the outside world and would most likely only know their domains. This got me thinking that maybe the 5 children swallowed by Kronos are more in tune to their domains than Zeus and his children, because they spent the better part of the beginning of their existence, with that being the only bit of knowledge they had. While having a bit of company would have made this torture far more bearable, I had no wish to spend however long I'm going to spend in here listening to Hera prattle on about the sanctity of marriage, listening to Demeter talk about the health benefits that an immortal being can gain from eating grain, or hearing how much cooler the sea is than the underworld from Poseidon. While I was sure Hestia was still excellent, I had spent so long without company. What was a few more years anyway? That is what I first thought anyway, but after what had been at least a few hundred years, I would have been quite happy to listen to a bunch of newborn deities prattle about whatever the Tartarus they wanted. I now understood exactly what canon Hades felt like. Being trapped on your own for so long would make you wish for any company, even that of your annoying immortal siblings. Instead, I spent the entire time sorting through my divinity, seeing if I could find any way at all to access it while inside Kronos' belly, coming up with no such luck. From my understanding, Kronos was using his immortal essence to disrupt any attempts at accessing my divinity, using his far older and more excellent knowledge of the divine to halt my attempts. I was stuck once again inside my head, counting away until the time would eventually come when Zeus would free us. I knew the time must have been growing nearer, as Poseidon had stumbled his way into here what must have been a few hundred years back now. So, all I was waiting for was a Zeus-like rock tumbling in here. However, as more and more time passed, I couldn't begin to help but wonder if I was tricked somehow, if this reincarnation was the beginning of a great torment, if this would be in a world where Rhea doesn't deceive Kronos and I would be stuck in here for eternity. It was as these ideas began to truly grow and fester that I was startled back to awareness by a heavy rock crashing into my misty form, The force from the crash caused me to ricochet off the walls of the Titan King's belly like a hockey puck before my momentum finally came to a stop. It shouldn't even have been possible. I was a physical being, so the rock should have passed right through, and I'll be honest, it did get me thinking if this was a sign of things to come. I hadn't even met Zeus yet, and he was already annoying me. Although combined with annoyance, it was a deep feeling of relief. After all, this was a sign that canon events were beginning to unfold, and soon to an immortal being, I would be free of this hellscape and could finally start to explore my new powers and put some of my plans into action. Such as giving Kronos one great kick in the balls for all the misery he put me and my siblings. Now, though I could understand why the elder gods could grow to be envious of Zeus after all, if I hadn't been able to see the pure joy and love in Rhea's face when she gazed upon me, I too would have begun to believe she was playing favorites in allowing Zeus to escape while dooming the rest of us to torment. But at the end of the day, without the aid of Gaia, even tricking Kronos would have been impossible, so all's well and ends well. Now, all I had to do was survive a few more years in the belly of the beast, and then it was a free reign of the cosmos. It looked like things were starting to look up for the Lord of the Dead after all. All I had to do was wait. 10 comments 0 vote. Heavy is the head that bears the crown. Kronos Pav. My whole immortal life was spent in subservience, bowing to those fate had forced me to view as my superior. Being the youngest son of two of the most powerful beings in the cosmos can leave one in negligence. By the time I was brought into being, any love Gaia and Oranos may have had for one another had long since faded. I know my conception was one of hatred and lust rather than any love or need. Maybe that is why I turned out as I did, cursed from birth. Burdened with sharing the name with a being of such great power as Kronos, the embodiment of time itself. Such a thing would have overshadowed any other being. I, however, was burdened with a doomed fate, a fate so cruel it would be spoken about as long as words shall be told, a curse placed upon my very essence. After all, Kronos has another meaning, to cut. Looking back now at all my decisions leaves me wondering if any of my choices were mine or if I was just being forced in a direction, dancing to the whims of fate. Not that any of it matters now anyway, it's too late. Any choice or free will I held ended when I accepted that scythe from Mother, and agreed to the accursed fate of a kinslayer. Looking back now, is it any coincidence that he who is burdened with the name, to cut, is the one who stepped forward to cut down his father? Maybe my life was one great plot, a classic tragedy created by my mother to remove a tool that had run out of control. After all, names hold power, and my name is cursed. Not that I can put full blame on Gaia, as I know that all that rage and hatred towards Oranos was my own. Not even my aunt Anenk could fake that. No, I wanted him dead. He deserved it. He was cruel and hateful, and deep down, I knew I could do better. I knew that I would not grow complacent as he had, that I would never treat my kin like he did. Like Mother did. Looking back now, I can't believe my arrogance. I didn't even wait for the father to die before complacency and conceit began to take hold. I can't help but think how different things would be if I had just cut him down, quick and clean before he even had a chance to react. But no, instead, I needed to feel stronger. My father had looked down on me and my siblings our entire lives. After all, we weren't protogonoi like him. His little failures were not quite as monstrous as the Cyclops or Hecatonchires, but still imperfect, unlike him. So I wanted to rub my victory in his face to let the perfect, all-powerful Oranos know his poor sons had defeated him. If only I had Koyo's wisdom, I would have seen his smug grin. One last laugh to destroy any future his children ever had. I can still hear his voice haunting me. My sons, just as they have done to me, I curse them to befall the same fate by their own. At first, these words rang hollow. After all, what did the words of a dying man, no matter how powerful he was in life, have to bear on the new king of the cosmos? But still deep down I sensed these words to be true. But as I watched my siblings spread out and had their children, I felt his curse had no hold. After all, while my siblings' children held great strength, not even the mighty Atlas, the strongest of my nephews and nieces, held the power to challenge me. And so I believed I gave in to my love for Rhea, and for a time, all was well. Although many may call me a liar, no one can deny my happiness when Rhea announced her pregnancy. But then the birth, when Hestia came into the world, all I felt was happiness. The sun blazed down from the sky and the whole of Mount Orthes celebrated the birth of an heir. At least until Hestia released a fraction of her power, all the smiles died. Hestia alone could not challenge me, but he was different, smaller, and far more beautiful than the average Titan baby. Now, this could be put down to the fact she was born from the most beautiful Titan Rhea, but her essence held far more divinity than even some of my brothers, and all I could hear was my father's laughter in my ear before, in a flash of gold, she was gone. I could feel her immature divinity fighting against my hold with strength no newborn should have. This only strengthened my resolve. Rhea and I didn't speak much after that. What was there to talk about? She was the titan of motherhood, and I had forced her to watch me devour our child, our happiness. I had offered her anything when we married. All she had asked for was a family, and I had destroyed that before it could even begin. A part of me died that day. Gone was the once power titan king, and in its place a cowardly king cannibal. Most call me brave for facing down Oranos. If only they knew the truth that their great king feared the power of his children, that I refused even to try to defy fate and instead devoured my child. Any other woman would have run after that, but Rhea was always different. Each time she would get pregnant, we would pray for a titan, a child I was sure I could love and would find no need to devour. Still, each time my father's curse rang true, first the soft Demeter, then poor fiery Hera, and finally the first boy Hades, unlike his sisters who radiated strength none of which could have challenged me, but this child he reeked of death. His power pulsed in a way I was sure could one day even eclipse my own, and so once again, I had to devour him. This one would surely be the threat to my throne. And for a second, I had myself convinced that I had succeeded, that I had defeated my father's prophecy, that I had defeated fate, and that the next child would be a titan. Still, once again, I would be proven wrong. Poseidon was born with an aura similar to my brother Oceanus and quickly gained strength just like his brother. What else could I do but get rid of him to protect my brother's rule? As Poseidon joined his siblings, I couldn't help but notice the broken, glassy look in eyes and a speck of hatred. Of course, Rhea could never hate me forever, so when she got pregnant again, we once again celebrated, genuinely believing that this would be the one child to save our marriage, only for the worst child yet to be born. As an immortal, fate and karma are fickle, almost nonsensical concepts. So when all my hopes looked like they were finally going to come true, only for another child born just as solid and godly as his brothers, Zeus, but where they held control over concepts foreign to me, this child had the look of the sky, the look of my father. Lightning danced between his soul and the pungent smell of ozone filled my senses. It was like reliving the fateful day all over again. So, not even giving Rhea a chance to hold the child I devoured. Bearing the same powers as my father, this was the one the prophecy spoke of. While I was still willing to try for more children, this had been the last straw for Rhea. She could stand me no longer and fled Mount Orthes without even a goodbye. With Rhea gone, what little of my sanity fled me, and Orthes became like a prison holding me. Even my brothers staved clear in fear of my wrath, unknowing of my sacrifice for them. Fate was a cruel mistress, and it always extracted its toll. I'll never know if the choices I've taken were my own, but it is I who must live with them. If the world needs a monster, I'll be the monster, not like there's anything else left for me to be. 12 comments 0 vote. The beginning of the Lightning King. Unknown author. After the fall of Oranos and the rise of Mount Orthes, it would be fair to assume that the authority of Kronos would be absolute and that no one would be willing to go against his rule. After all, with scythe in hand, even the ancient protogonoi were vulnerable to Kronos' wrath. If not for Kronos' act in imprisoning his monstrous brothers after they built Mount Orthes for him, it may have been impossible for Rhea to find any help at all in freeing her divine children from the Titan King's belly. Fortunately for the Titan mother, these exact actions would cause Kronos to fall out of favor with his mother, the earth itself, Gaia. Wroth at her son's oath-breaking and the imprisoning of her eldest children, the Hecatonchires an elder Cyclops, and beginning to see signs of her ex-husband's paranoia. She would visit her daughter Rhea while in labor with her sixth and final child. During this visit, she promises to hide the child from Kronos and use a rock shrouded in her ex-husband's scattered essence to trick Kronos into swallowing it in a maddened rage. After all, Kronos is known as the Crooked One for a reason, as the most cunning and intelligent of the Titans, and tricking him would only be possible if he was enraged or distracted. So when the time eventually came for Rhea to give birth to her youngest child, Gaia quickly replaced the child with the shrouded rock made to look like a divine form using the mist, empowered by Oranos' scattered form. Kronos would feel his father's power and be put into a ravenous rage, not even giving the mother of said child a chance to name it before he would devour it. Of course, unknown to him, this was all part of Gaia and Ray's plan. Kronos' rage closed his eyes to such a trick, allowing Gaia to quickly spirit the newborn god away to the hidden island of Crete. It was here Gaia would hand the child to a nymph known as Amalthea, an old and beautiful nymph who would use a cave at the base of Mount Ida to hide away from lustful titans. Amalthea would raise the young god with short visits from Rhea and Gaia, occurring occasionally, and then telling the deity tales of his siblings' imprisonment and the tyranny arising under his father's rule. Under Amalthea's tutelage, God would learn the ancient magics of the earth's spirits, including alchemy, seals, and physical form transformation. The god whose physical form you would describe as tall and robust with muscles rippling with power, long curly hair that ran past his shoulders, black in coloring but littered with white spots that glittered like snowflakes, a beard that shared the same color pattern that was neatly kept and trimmed that clung to his powerful jaw. His eyes reflected that sky itself, switching from clear blues to electric sparks depending on the mood of their owner. His face was handsome and proud with his sculptured features and skin that was like hardened marble. He would train day and night, mastering any art, whether mastery over his domain or weapon training. He would work himself until his physical form would begin to wither. All with one goal, to free his siblings and overthrow his father's rule. This god would eventually become known as Zeus, king of the heavens and lord of the sky, god of the sky, thunder and lightning, honor and justice, and kingship and order. The mightiest and overall ruler of the cosmos. The fated king that would hold dominion over the cosmos by fate's own words. A being of near absolute power within his pantheon, fearing none but the strongest beings. Zeus, mastery over the sky would grant him strength beyond that of his fellow gods, being the manipulator over the vast celestial body that would surround existence, allowing none to escape his gaze or might. It was only through hardships and the teachings provided by Rhea and Amalthea that Zeus would grow to be the strongest of the gods. Granting Zeus access to ancient knowledge most gods would not be privy to. Learning the old tongue, Gaia gave to the Titans during their creation a power rooted in the very earth itself and knowledge of the magic of nature's spirits. It was sometime when Rhea would introduce her son Zeus to her niece, by her siblings Oceanus and Tethys, known as Métis, Titan of wise counsel. Zeus would grow besotted by the beauty and wit of Métis, coming to admire her wisdom. He would often seek her advice in matters related to his domain and unknown her battle plans for overthrowing his father. Eventually, he seduces her, causing her to betray her kin and agree to help Zeus beat his father. Métis, one of the wisest beings in existence, guided Zeus into being able to turn himself into a Titan using the old tongue of the Titan. This would allow Zeus to hide his aura and make him seem like a lesser Titan, making his trip into Mount Orthes much easier than it otherwise would have been. Once inside Orthes, Zeus would charm himself into becoming his father's cupbearer after weeks of service, using his singing and dancing to entertain the Titan, until he eventually managed to trick them into having a drinking contest. Here, he would use an elixir created by himself and Métis to poison the Titan King. This would cause him to regurgitate all that he had eaten violently. First, a smooth rock shrouded in clouds, afterward was a green orb that smelt of sea salt, then a shadow of darkness that seemed to absorb the light from the room that reeked of death, followed by a ball of light that flashed gold and white and gave off an aura of regality, then an earthy brown ball that smelt of freshly cut grass. Finally came a bright ember that caused all the other orbs as well as Zeus himself to calm. Acting quickly and without hesitation, Métis grabbed the orbs and stuffed them in a clay pot covered in the ancient tongue that shimmered with a gold glow before evaporating into gold dust in the Titan's hands. Kronos, quickly realizing what was wrong, reached for his scythe, but before he could even act, was blasted off his feet by a gust of air that would have ruptured a mortal's eardrums. Métis quickly dissolved into sea mist, fleeing the scene. Following this act, Zeus transformed into an eagle and soared out of Orthes to the sound of the Titan King's roar. With Zeus' siblings freed, the first blood of the Titanomachy would be struck in God's favor, a sign of things to come as well as a symbol of any suffering under the King Cannibal's rule, that the one who slew the sky was not as infallible as once believed. With the other Chronides' power released, it would significantly increase the rebellion's strength, allowing Zeus and his allies to defy Kronos' rule actively. With this act, the gears of fate would once again begin to move, a sign of the beginning of a new age, one of enlightenment and splendor. A story that had been written before even the earth itself. 4 comments 0 vote. I get caught in a pot. Hades Pav. I underestimated how long I would be waiting after Rock Zeus joined us in Dad's belly. After all, in all the myths I can remember, gods tend to grow up much quicker than mortals. In the birth story of Artemis and Apollo, Artemis helps Apollo be born, giving her the divinity of childbirth, taking the domain from Eileithyia, Hera's daughter, and Athena jumps out of Zeus' head in full battle armor. So when months turned to years, I genuinely worried about when we would be freed from this place. Although, I suppose that I think that Zeus would need something of an upbringing if he could not only trick Kronos into hiring him but also make it so the most paranoid being in Greek mythology, except Zeus himself, trusts him enough to drink his elixir. So, I'll admit to being very relieved when the walls that had spent my entire time here attempting to destroy my very being began to shake and weaken, leading to lightning-like cracks forming in the malicious gold surface, allowing for a bit of my divine form to seep through the cracks created. The space provided allowed me actually to make use of my divinity for once. So I did what any divine being would do if their parent swallowed them would do, and caused a tiny bit of my divine energy to char the inside of my father's stomach, just as a classic act of child rebellion, a finale fuck you for causing me to suffer for being born. It was once I was finally done leaving a divine ulcer inside my father's stomach when I was violently ejected from my acidic home. The familiar discomforting sensation of being passed through a hard surface rattled my incorporeal form as I burst free from my father's stomach like a miserable version of the Kool-Aid Man. Being the third of my siblings, and yes, I'm counting Rock Zeus as a sibling, to be regurgitated from father's stomach allowed me to be able to see Orthes for the first time. Indeed, the walls were all made from pitch-black marble that simultaneously gave off an aura of majesty and fear. Due to the natural size of the Titan, the building was uncomfortable tall. It made me feel like an ant, with high walls that would have been the size of a particularly tall mortal museum, fitted with colossal thrones that stood like towers. Each throne shared a trait with the one occupying it. Hyperion, throne was made of molten gold and held rotating suns at the end of each arm. Iapetus was made of the same pitch-black marble that made up the walls yet was littered with silvery splotches that glistened. Creo's throne resembled the endlessness of space with bright galaxies and stars rotating it. However, the throne I had just been thrown at the foot of caught my eye. Lifted an excellent few feet higher than the rest of the thrones, made up of stones of pure black obsidian, with the cracks filled in with molten gold, fitted with a variety of jewels and diamonds, the backrest of the throne held a silver hourglass containing gold sand that seemed never to end, and the arms of the chair had a sheath for the scythe of the Titan King. And while I would have loved to continue to marvel at my dad's cool and edgy throne, he was, unfortunately, sitting on it, and as cool as the throne would have customarily been, when there was a psycho, murdering kinslayer sat upon it, it lost a lot of its excellent points. The big man himself, however, was too busy trying to work off any effect Zeus' special elixir was having on him, to go all slashy with the cool scythe of his, slumped over his throne, hands on his stomach, looking like the result of a night out. Of course, the fact it was his kids and not sick that was coming out did offset the image slightly. Still, the image amused me so that I will stick with it. Before I could continue to analyze my father's state, the last of my siblings came flying out of my father's belly, leaving a calming sensation inside my soul, who I'm going to guess is Hestia. The loss of his last snack seemed to galvanize father as he realized we'd broken out of his stomach prison. However, I felt a cold hand enclose my form before he could act on it. Turning around, I'm greeted by one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen, and considering I'm in a room full of near-perfect immortal beings, that says something. She still isn't as attractive as Mother Rhea. I can see the appeal with a beautiful, athletic, feminine body, long black hair that flowed like waves past her collarbone, and attractive regal features that scream I'm a queen. However, of all her features, it was the startling gray eyes that shined with intellect, looking deeply into my being like she was thinking of 100 ways that she could destroy me. It was these same eyes that I'd heard described 1,000 times in the books in my old life, the eyes of Athena. However, as the woman whom I had now identified as Métis grabbed me, I heard a menacing roar of the awakening Titan. Before I could even begin to panic, though, I was quickly bundled up into a group with my fellow stomach pals before being unceremoniously dumped into a clay pot that looked like it had been graffitied by a group of toddlers using a golden Sharpie. Before I could begin to protest my rough handling, Métis started to whisper in an unrecognizable tongue that sounded like a bunch of different croaks and groans. Once she finished speaking, gold energy seeped into the walls of the pot like fog, entering my very being before quickly retreating. Confused, I was about to try and take a physical form and ask what the hell that was before my vision flashed with bright gold light, and I was gone once more, hopefully for the last time. 6 comments 0 vote. Let's get physical. Hades Pav. In my past life, I always wondered what teleportation would feel like. After all, it was in pretty much every piece of pop culture, and each one was depicted differently. In Harry Potter, it was stated as feeling like you were pushed through a rubber tube. So, let's say my expectations were high for the divine equivalent of apparition. So when my essence seemed to turn itself intangible before being supercharged into a bright gold light, I was a little disappointed. After all, I was expecting much more. Every bit of media described teleportation as being discomforting and downright revolting at the best of times, so it was a bit of a key for it to be very smooth and comfortable. I was not complaining. it would be pretty awkward to appear in front of your followers in a blaze of gold light only to sit down for a minute to gather your bearings. However, this led me to conclude that because we gods are more like living energy rather than physical beings, we are granted the ability to turn ourselves intangibly to pass through realms, allowing us the ability to travel from one place to another nearly instantaneously. Of course, a caveat to this is that it does not allow us to bring physical beings along with us, at least not living ones. Not only would gazing on our divine forms destroy their souls if we were even to try, but the act of passing between realms would cause their mortal bodies to dissolve. I assume this is why gods try to learn other transportation methods like shadow travel. Overall, it's pretty neat and beats public transport anyway. Once, I got over the awe that I, an ex-human, had just teleported, an act that most people would declare impossible. I decided that it was time I got out of this bland pot, as while it was very much preferable to my murderous father's destructive stomach, it still wasn't something I wanted to spend any more time than necessary sitting in, especially when I was being smooshed into a corner by my siblings. So, trying to recapture the feeling of intangibility that came with our teleportation, I could phase myself through the pot walls with much more ease than I had expected. With my newfound freedom, I decided it was time I tried to take a physical form. After all, I was pretty attached to having arms and legs and had no interest in spending the rest of eternity as a glorified nightlight. You see, as a god, theoretically, I would need to spend no time at all learning to control all of my powers. After all, the knowledge was just forced into my soul from birth. If I were to center myself and look inside my being, I would be able to see all aspects related to my domain. The screams of souls yet to be born, and the whisper of plots of beings yet even to be conceived would be whispered through my very essence. Yet, my past life as a human did still leave me with a general sense of what was possible and what wasn't, so when thoughts and ideas on how to create myself a flesh suit passed across my mind, I did spend a few seconds contemplating the insanity of it all. However, my disbelief was quickly replaced with growing excitement at finally being able to speak and feel again. So fast, focusing on the divine energy that pulsed deep within my very being, I turned what was once a bright gold mist into a rotating sphere of molten gold. Gripping the sphere, I manipulated it into the shape of a human man. The frame of the man was tall and imposing, standing at an unnatural height of over 10 feet tall, rippling with hardened muscle that shone with gold light under the pasty white marble skin that clung to the frame. Hair like molten lava flowed down to the man's broad shoulders, while a well-kept beard seemed to smoke like it was just set alight. His features were inhumanly perfect, with each side of his face being symmetrical to the other, a broad nose that looked shaped out of marble and an angular and powerful jaw that looked like it could be used to crack boulders into two. However, the most striking features of the being were a pair of pitch-black obsidian eyes that seemed to roll with molten tar yet held blazing hellfire deep within the iris. In conclusion, if my mortal shell existed in my past life, he'd be on the cover of every magazine the world had. I was pretty proud of my first ever physical form. I thought it looked great, and I'm sure in a few thousand years, I'd probably want to look a lot older than a particularly mature-looking young adult, especially if I had children by then. It would certainly work for the first few thousand years. Once I was done adding the last few finishing touches, I began to place myself inside the form, feeling the ichor I had placed inside the shell come to life with divine power, the infinite knowledge of my domains flooding my being. It had been so long since I had last been a physical being that it was a little weird to get back into, like when you stop playing a game for a while but then return to it only to realize you've forgotten all of your combos, such as how to balance correctly when walking. I have never been more thankful that my siblings are truly newborn and have yet to take physical forms. After all, I doubt I could maintain any fear of being the god of the dead if the first act my siblings saw were for me to fall flat on my face after taking a mortal form. Speaking of my siblings, unlike me, who had a past life of fanfiction and media to go off when creating my mortal body, they are taking a lot longer to escape our pot prison and make a mortal form. In fact, out of all my siblings, only Hestia had so far fled the pot but was still struggling to decide her human form, so suffice to say, I have a feeling I'll be waiting here a while for my siblings to either create their mortal forms or for Zeus and Métis to return from Orthes, so I might as well explore our temporary home of Mount Ida in the meantime. 3 comments 0 vote. I go cave diving. Hades Pav. With my mind made up, I decided exploring my temporary home of Mount Ida would be a more helpful waste of my time than watching my siblings stumble their way into making their physical form. And even though I'm sure it would be great blackmail for the future, I am genuinely curious to know what Zeus' childhood home looks like. After all, I can't remember any descriptions granted to it other than it being a cave hidden on the island of Crete at the base of Mount Ida. My initial impressions are that there must be some nature magic going on in this cave for it to be as beautiful as it is because, in my last life, every cave I've been into was a dark and dreary place, devoid of any light bar any natural sunlight that can seep through any cracks or crevices with a pungent smell of damp. But this place blew those beliefs out of the water, with an almost perfect circular entrance that seemed to attract the sun into the cave. It was like Helios himself was in awe of its beauty, spreading his light to every corner of the cave. From the entrance also came to a waterfall filled with clear sky blue water filled with various naiads, that ran deep into the depths of the cave flowing through each of the 3 layers of the cave, splitting the cave into 2 with only a bridge of moss, cobble, and vines tying the 2 sides together. On both sides of the cave were houses made from trees, that had branches that seemed to move in unison like a sacred dance, with windows made of ice and luminescent plant decorating and brightening the houses. They gave the houses a look of minimalistic beauty. Inside the small town cave were families of nymphs that radiated in a greenish glow that seemed to give life to any vegetation they passed. And damn, were they hot, like imagine high fantasy elves slightly smaller, although that could just be because I was so tall, wearing ancient Greek chittons made up from whatever made up their environment, whether it be vines or merely leaves. Various plants littered the cave like baubles on a Christmas tree, adding a sparkle of flavor and coloring in an already beautiful habitat, whether they be flower beds made up of colors that would have been called fantasy in my past life or bright-colored mushrooms that reminded me of Mario. Each bit of flora was a piece of a jigsaw that made up the beauty of the cave. Unfortunately, I learned pretty quickly not to touch any of the flora, as it turns out being the god of the dead doesn't go well with being a green thumb. Any vegetation I felt would begin to wither and decay under my palm. To avoid getting a bonk on the head from upset nature spirits, I decided to keep my distance from the plants. The whole cave gave off a natural beauty that would have been impossible for any mortal to achieve, no matter the time or funding required. No, this beauty only came after thousands of years of dedicated worship by the nature spirits that made up the cave system, although I'm sure the blessing of Gaia, whose power I could feel deep within the cave's soil, indeed must have helped. It was hard to miss being far more ancient and earthly than my siblings, including Demeter. The view of the cave alone made me wonder if I made a mistake not choosing to be reincarnated as Zeus. I mean, come on, how could he not grow up to be a womanizing asshole when he grew up in a place as beautiful as this, surrounded by fabulous and flirty nature spirits, and then had to give it all up to come and rule the cosmos? Like I'd be angry all the time, too. Overall, I'll admit to being exceptionally jealous of any deity related to nature. Not only will they be close to all the beautiful nature spirits, but views like this will also be possible to create with their powers. Something that, as the god of the dead and king of the underworld, will be impossible to do. After all, life and nature are my antitheses. So, there is no calm nature kingdom for me. I mean, maybe it's the fact I'm the god of the dead that's making me so jealous. After all, no matter how powerful I become, I will still be bound to the rules of the underworld. So, no matter how much I want to, no life could be created there. Unless I made plants that were both dead yet still looked good, I doubt I could maintain my image of the badass ruler of the Greek afterlife if I spent my time trying to create flowers, so maybe it's for the best anyway. Even though I couldn't replicate the cave due to the underworld's limitations, it gave me some ideas on how I want the underworld to look when I eventually can claim it as my own. After all, like hell, will I spend eternity living in a pale imitation of Olympus like the original Hades made in his bitterness? Nope, not me. I will ensure that my realm will be as grand and beautiful as my brother's kingdoms. After finally getting over my little exploration of Zeus' home, I decided it was time to return to my siblings. A lot of time had passed between me creating my physical form and coming out to explore the cave, and indeed, at least one of my siblings had managed to complete the transition from incorporeal to human by now. Meeting my siblings one at a time rather than all 5 at once seemed more straightforward. 15 comments 0 vote. I'm gonna be older brother. Hades Pav. After my exploration, I began my quick journey back to my siblings, arriving to find a half-formed body resembling a female form. However, the features were so unrecognizable that only my godly powers allowed me to identify that it was Hera. Demeter had escaped the pot but seemed to catch up in soaking up the surrounding nature to realize she should probably start creating a physical form. Poseidon, however, was currently still struggling to find him out of the pot, not that I could blame him. With the sea cannot be restrained, thing going, all divine energy resembled the domains that they were connected to. Mine cold and refined opposed to Poseidon, wild and untamable. He'd get it eventually, but for now I'd enjoy watching him squirm trying to catch up. It took far more time than I'd care to admit for me to realize Hestia was missing. Considering that she had just escaped the pot when I left, I expected to arrive at her nearly fully forged form, but it wasn't until a bit of kindling of a flame in the corner of the room caught my eye. Eyes widening in the realization, I gazed upon the clothed form of a young child, anywhere from 8 to 10 years old, wrapped in a dull earth brown dress, head covered with a fitting scarf poking at a small flame with a fire poker. Taking a minute to gather myself, I strode confidently towards the young girl, arriving just a few feet from her. I expected the girl to turn towards me or, at the very least, react immediately. Still, after a few minutes passed by and the only noise was the crackling of embers, I cleared my throat to catch the girl's attention only to face the cold, hard wall of silence once more. After another minute or so where I sat in disbelief at being ignored, I proceeded to close the last few feet of difference separating me and my sibling, attempting to place my hand on the girl's shoulder, only to have the action halted when she quickly spun around to face me. Their eyes were comprehensive and doe-like, alight with the same flame that she sat tending to, short brown locks gathered on her head, while her features were young and delicate, cheeks with a bit of child fat and lips that seemed made for pouting. Like every immortal, she held an unnatural look to her too perfect features that would have given an uncomfortable look to her childlike features, especially considering the intelligence and power behind her eyes. Of course, the aura of comfort that she radiated quickly dispelled any discomfort that might have been given by gazing upon her features. The wonderful smell that I can only describe as burning wood and roasting marshmallows only hammered home the rightness of being next to such a being. As for her divinity, well, let's say I could understand why both Poseidon and Apollo fell over each other in an attempt to win her heart. Merely standing beside her created a calmness in my being that should have been impossible for a near all-powerful being. The very nature of our powers created restlessness and temper, yet beside her, I felt calm and at home. Hestia's divinity would be considered attractive to any god, shaped like a bright, warm flame and lit with the power of an elder god. If not for the fact that I could already feel the connection forming between us, declaring us as siblings, then not even the taboo of my past life would be able to hold me back from falling for her. After all, the attraction between deities is formed by how one looks physically. We're shapeshifters, we can examine how we want. If Hestia wanted to, she could look like a busty supermodel, but rather the feeling their divine essence gives off, and Hestia was probably as beautiful as you could get. Further thought is cut off by a timid voice whispering, "Are you okay?" The voice was as soothing as the presence of the one who wielded it and seeped into my very being, further putting me into a state of near sleep, something that should have been impossible, being God and all. As I began to close my eyes to slumber, I was cut off by a high-pitched, eepp. Before the fog that had started to roll into my eyes quickly began to retreat, restoring me to my state of ultra-awareness that comes with being a god. Looking up I see a highly embarrassed and sorry-looking Hestia, who looked like she came flying out of an anime, the shuffling of her feet portraying her embarrassment and flushed gold cheeks only completed the image. Before throwing herself at me with a speed and force that would have torn even a lesser immortal in half, tying me up in a deathlock of a hug, breaking out into a string of, "IMSORRY. IMSORRY. IMSORRY." I decided to take pity on her by reciprocating her hold. After a few minutes trapped in the hold, Hestia seemed to finally decide that she had apologized enough and quickly jumped back out of my hold, gazing up at me with eyes full of curiosity, quickly scanning me from head to toe, like she was trying to figure out what my weakest point was to take me down, amusing considering the height difference, me being a colossal over 10 feet tall and her barely reaching my knee. Seemingly satisfied with whatever she was looking for, she nodded to herself before pointing one of her small digits on her chin like she was pondering before muttering out seemingly to herself, "So you, my brother." Before I could even respond, she once more nodded to herself before her eyes shone with ancient gold power, once more reminding me that despite her youthful and childlike actions, she was still an elder god, and bright gold lines began to link our divinities together in an unbreakable bond of family. While this action was quite wholesome, considering it only amplified any familial love already being built between us, I was slightly uncomfortable that she could manipulate my emotions so quickly, even if I wasn't prepared to defend against it. However, when I once more looked into her warm, naive eyes, I remembered all the heartache and sadness that followed Hestia throughout the canon. Considering every act her siblings took spat upon her domains, I couldn't help but feel sorry for her and at least promise in my head to be slightly better than my original counterpart, if only for her sake. As if she could read my mind, her pouty lips stretched into a goofy, childlike smile that warmed my immortal being, and she once more threw herself at me in a bone-crushing embrace. After what would be conventionally considered an uncomfortable amount of time in my past life, it felt too short in this one as when Hestia finally let me go. The warm and calming presence that had settled my being was released, as the last of her power left my being as her hold was released. Again, she opened me up to the raw immortal power that sang beneath my skin. It took me a moment to recover from my Hestia withdrawal symptoms. Still, when I eventually did, I saw Hestia had once more returned to her embers, only to discover it had turned into a roaring flame. Her presence had seemed far more noticeable and tangible than before, as the smell of wood smoke and marshmallows perforated throughout the room, filling my non-existent sinuses like smog. With her back turned to me and armed with her mighty fire poker, which left me wondering where the hell she got that form, considering summoning and banishing objects capable of holding divine energy shouldn't be possible. Blacksmiths and forgers exist for a reason. I assumed our conversation was over. And while having such a warm and comfortable meeting with one of my siblings should have left me hopeful for meeting the rest, the suspicions that followed me from my past life reminded me that, unlike Hestia, my other siblings were a lot more prickly. So, with a lighter heart yet a troubled mind, I sat down next to Hestia and waited for the rest of my siblings. 14 comments 0 vote. When life meets death, and they talk about flowers. Hades Pav. Despite my initial beliefs, it wasn't Hera who was the next of my siblings to complete the transformation from incorporeal to corporeal. This wasn't because Hera was struggling with the creation process. Nope, it was because every time it looked like Hera had finally decided what she would look like, she would suddenly wipe it clean and start again. And, while I may not be able to speak about being a narcissist, considering I made my form as handsome as I could be based on my previous life's beauty standards, spending that amount of time deciding on a physical form that could be changed or altered any time seemed a bit too much, even for me. Especially when you consider attraction between immortals came from their divinities rather than physical attraction, and as the goddess of marriage and future patron of women, it was all completely unnecessary. Out of all my sisters, Hera's divinity was the most seductive and desirable. It tugged on your being playfully and called to you, so wasting so much time deciding which color hair you wanted and in what style just seemed a bit pointless. Demeter, on the other hand, had finally gotten over all the nature everywhere and was putting the finishing touches upon her physical form. It looked like the time she took soaking in her surroundings may have helped her with her design as she painted her lustrous blonde hair the color of gold wheat with dried grass. Woven between each strand of hair like a wicker basket, skin slightly tanned like she was out in the sun all day, her form was busty and filled out in all the right places, a firm reminder that she was also a goddess of fertility while still holding to an impressive 8 feet tall. Her features contained a soft and almost motherly appearance. At the same time, her eyes were warm dirt brown that flared with green light whenever she would gaze upon the surrounding flora. Overall, I could tell she took heavy inspiration from our mother and her domains, which contain the same motherly and fertile appearance as the mother Titan, while also creating a flair of her own. Once she had finally taken on her physical shell, she conjured a long green dress made up of different bits of flora leaves gathering around her bosom like a bra and various vines and flowers, creating woven designs that ended just before her feet. In conclusion, where Hestia had tried to make herself as innocent and sisterly as possible, Demeter acknowledged her beauty and weaponized it, unafraid of the consequences. I could see why both Zeus and Poseidon desired her so much. Her aura was bright and earthly and buzzed with excitement. Instead, that was just its natural state, or because of all the surrounding nature, I don't know. Still, the way it livened all the surrounding vegetation caused flowers to bloom at her feet and vines to stretch towards the cave's floor as if to be closer to her. It made me believe that she must be going through a state of empowerment from being so close to her domain. Despite being a few feet away from her, I could feel the strong smell of fresh-cut grass spreading through my being. Unfortunately, this had some unintended consequences. Demeter, being a life-giver, aka my complete opposite, upset my divinity, giving me a feeling of unjustified irritation. The best way I could describe it was having an unfair negative opinion of someone you've never met before but being too stubborn to admit you might be wrong. She hadn't even acknowledged my and Hestia's presence yet and was spending her time running back and smelling different flora instead, which only fueled my unreasonable feelings. If not for the calming hand of Hestia on my shoulder, I truly believe I would have blown up in a string of profanities that would not yet be invented for the next few thousand years and would have thus looked like I'd gone insane, as none of them would have been able to understand me. Grabbing hold of Hestia's essence and making use of it to purge any unwanted feelings, I decided that it was probably time I introduced myself, because the way she was going, I would have sat there for years waiting for her to get over all the nature. It took only a quick few strides for me to cover the distance between my green thumb sister, who was currently crouched over a lovely flower, and me, palm face down towards it, releasing a mist of green sparks that seemed to cause the already full-bloom flower to grow to an unnatural height, being as tall as the average human with each petal being the size of a man's head. Demeter seemed fascinated with what she had just done, eyes filled with glee and awe, gazing at the flower like it was the finest piece of jewelry in the world. Deciding that waiting for her to get over her glee with the flower to turn around and acknowledge me would take far too long, I outstretched my hand towards her shoulder while clearing my throat. I didn't account for sparks of orange light between my palm and her shoulder, causing a singeing sensation upon my palm. Her high-pitched, ooey, allowed me to realize the pain was a two-way street. Shaking my hand a few times to rid it of the uncomfortable sensation, I look back at my sister only to see glassy brown eyes and trembling lips glaring up at me before a sharp, stinging sensation spreads across my shin. Gazing downwards to see a foot hastily retreating behind the safety of a dress. Lifting my eyes back to the owner of said foot, the grimacing look of pain gave me the idea that the kick may have hurt her more than me, but her stubborn pride wouldn't allow that to show genuinely. Thinking that I should probably apologize to get rid of any misconceptions, my grave voice, unused to speaking such a long sentence, released, apologies. I should have probably realized our domains being antithesis would affect each other. Turns out to be the god of the dead and king of the underworld affected my presence that Demeter as a being of life couldn't handle without ample warning. She was still sniffling but looking calmer and less like she wanted to smite me for daring to touch her. She gazed into my eyes, head tilting in curiosity and eyes alight with a question, which looked far too much like a puppy for me to contain my amusement. Demeter, however, didn't seem to find my amusement acceptable, lips pursing and eyes gaining a little bit of sharpness. Her voice that sounded like soft summer rain released a scathing reply. Yeah, I mean, who would think a god of the dead would hurt life? Like imagine that. Despite the reply coming out harsh and uncaring, I could see a quick twitch of her lips, letting me know that while she was probably annoyed it was a lot lighter and not as harsh as her reply would make one believe. They decided the only appropriate reply would be to tease her. Yeah, I know, strange. Huh, of course, if someone was more aware of her surroundings and spent less time gawking at grass, they may have noticed that they have company. My lips holding what to me felt like a cheeky smirk, but it probably looked like a hellish smile to others. In reaction to my cheeky reply, Demeter's cheeks and nose gained a golden flush while her eyes began to come to life with green light, and her lips once more turned into a downturned pout. Despite our rocky start, Demeter and I got on far better than our canon counterparts anyway. And seen as though I had no interest in kidnapping her favored daughter and forcing her to marry me, nor following in Poseidon's or Zeus's footsteps, I felt we would remain relatively warm to one another. My like for Flora combined with her obsession for it allowed for good communication between us. I would have probably continued to speak to her for longer but saw Hestia gazing at us with a warm smile from her hearth, like a proud mother. Amusing, considering our forms towered over her childlike looks, convincing Demeter to go and introduce herself, which took far longer than it should have, but it turns out that despite enjoying our conversation, Demeter still preferred the company of flowers to her actual siblings. Only the promise of not bothering her again got her to make her way over to the hearth finally. However, from the delighted giggles that left Hestia and the beaming smile of Demeter that came only a mere few seconds after their introduction, it looked like Demeter had found someone she could talk the head of about nature with who wouldn't complain. With two of my siblings introduced, I felt more uncertain rather than lighter. After all, Hestia was pretty much guaranteed to be loving and familial. While Demeter was a surprise, she was far too absent-minded to be capable of being outright cruel for no reason. My other siblings, however, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hera were notorious for their cruelty and wrath, so waiting for them gave me an ominous feeling. 8 comments 0 vote. Strive for continuous improvement rather than perfection. Unless you're a goddess. Hera Pav. For mortals, birth is a frightening yet mysterious concept. It is an experience all have gone through, yet none can recall, yet all view it with a sense of dread and trepidation for the dire consequences that hang like a guillotine over both parent and child alike. Their fragile mortality, the constant reminder of the inevitability of death, shrouding what one should view as a happy and momentous occasion like a snake coiling around their prey. Immortals, however, view childbirth far differently. The undying nature of our beings turns what mortals consider a wary affair into no more than an everyday act. After all, we immortals aren't bound to the same laws of nature that all mortal life must follow. If one wishes, they could give birth as soon as an immortal is conceived or hold the child in their womb for thousands of years. As for said children, being born filled with knowledge and concepts far beyond mortal comprehension before even coming into existence can grant one a unique outlook on life. Being the patron of women and the goddess of familial love, few were as close to the giving of life as I. From conception, knowledge of beings yet to come and bonds yet to be made flowed through my very being like an ocean current. Unlike my siblings, my awareness of the surrounding world within my mother's womb was amplified due to the potent act from the mother of carrying an immortal child to full term. Such an act only empowered my growing divinity, allowing me to reach out and examine my surroundings. My divinity was so much like Rhea herself that she would favor me more than my previous siblings, creating my name from her own as a statement of her favor. This, of course, wouldn't help me avoid the same fate that had already befallen my sisters. Even, I, a goddess of familial love, was unable to see the difference between Kronos' perverted love and the love of a true father, leaving me unprepared for when he bound me to the same prison that held my siblings. Being the exact opposite of my domain, such an act almost caused my essence to scatter in distress. If not for the fact I could use the bonds in my sisters and held to ground myself, I may have well spread in God's endless being. Unfortunately, while this allowed me to stave off my father's continuous murder attempts, it did leave me with next to no access to my divinity, leaving me unable to use the said bond to reach out and communicate with my siblings. Such a thing would have made my time inside Kronos far more bearable. After all, who can one talk to if not family? Being so weakened did have its benefits. It made time pass far quicker than it would have, than if I was fully aware of my surroundings. Something I'm sure my siblings would be incredibly envious of. The only memories I have of my father's stomach are when I first entered and when another one of my siblings was devoured. When the time eventually came for us to be freed, I was the last one to leave, and for the first time since entering the prison, I was forced to bear the full force of Kronos' power, attempting one final act of destruction upon my being. Thankfully, whatever it was my youngest sibling had done, had caused Kronos' divine energy to be wild and uncontrollable, otherwise I was unsure if being immortal would be enough to save me. Once I finally finished my journey through Father's Gullet to join the rest of my siblings, I had no time at all to make use of my newfound freedom before a woman of regal stature captured us in a pot that radiated divine power. The discomforting feeling of passing through the realms quickly followed before I found myself staring up at the walls of a mountain cave. I'm only slightly ashamed of the spike of envy I felt flushing my being watching the eldest of my brothers quickly getting a handle of his divine power to create a physical form so fast. I'm even more ashamed to admit the feeling only grew watching my eldest sister Hestia complete hers only a few minutes later. Having enough of lagging behind my siblings, I quickly phased through the clay pot and began to forge my physical form. Only to discover it was a far more challenging accomplishment than I had expected, not the actual act itself. It was relatively easy to turn divine energy into ichor and even more straightforward to manipulate it into any shape I desired. No, the problems came when I began trying to create my appearance. When I was watching my siblings, neither seemed to care too much about how they looked, with Hestia even deciding on a young and pitiful appearance rather than one of great beauty, so when I found myself scrapping and restarting every time I came close to completion. So, enamored with creating the perfect appearance, I failed to notice my elder sister Demeter managing to make her form despite the fact she started after me. It's not my fault. Every time I was almost done, I would gaze upon my creation and feel an overwhelming sense of wrongness that would cause me to feel a burning hot rage. This rage would cause me to scrap all my progress to begin a new one. It didn't help that I could hear all my siblings introducing each other behind me, and as the goddess of familial love, being unable to participate in family bonding was particularly torture. With each restart, I could feel my anger grow, especially when my middle brother finally managed to stumble his way out of the pot and managed to complete his form before me. None of this would rush me, though. I was Hera, so favored by Mother Rhea that I was named in her honor, goddess of women and marriage, childbirth and familial love, the patron of women and queen of the heavens. I was a being of perfection. Beauty and elegance were part of my very being, and no matter how long it took, I would take a form fitting such perfection. 8 comments 0 vote. The sea god goes for a swim. Hades Pav. In my past life, the relationship between the big three could be described in one word: turbulent. Due to the nature of their domains, each of the brothers was very alike. All contained the ferocious temper of their father, Kronos, and a great sense of pride that most would consider arrogant. Despite their similar personalities, however, the big three all held harsh grudges towards one another that bordered outright hostility. In his paranoia, Zeus would only be able to see threats where he should have seen family. Poseidon's envy towards Zeus' power and throne and his apathy towards his eldest brother's plight would only further worsen the fragile bonds that held the brothers together. Canon Hades grudge towards what he saw as his brother's betrayal in banishing him from Olympus to rule over the underworld would shatter any chance of the brothers reconciling. This would leave the Greco-Roman pantheon in a cold war, with each brother constantly trying to undermine and weaken the other. This would boil over on many occasions, such as when Poseidon aided Hera and Athena in forcing Zeus to be a better ruler. This act would lead to Poseidon's banishment and temporary mortality at the hands of Zeus, where he would help build the walls of Troy. This would further expand the already existing bad blood between the three brothers. This hate and lack of communication would carry on to live into the beginning of the Percy Jackson books, with Hades having his lover killed by Zeus and being forced to hide his mortal children away. This would lead to multiple attempts on each other's children over the years leading up to the Great Prophecy, an act that would only be halted once the prophecy was completed. With all this in mind, I didn't have much hope of having a good relationship with my new brothers. After all, it wasn't like Hades did much to earn the brothers' ire. If anything, he was the most tame and least deserving of his brother's mistrust. So, watching Poseidon's physical form slowly come into being filled me with a strong sense of dread. In the ancient times, Poseidon, wrath was legendary. Even the most littlest of sparks would be enough for him to enter a world-ending fury. He was wild and untamable like the sea, and when you thought you could predict him, he'd flip on you and do something you could never have guessed. It wasn't until the start of canon that he'd finally began to mellow out, most likely due his relationship with one Sally Jackson. His Roman from Neptune, however, still held the same spark that raged inside the Stormbringer of old. In the times before Apollo, Poseidon was the patron of the Oracle of Delphi, granting him minor control over prophecies and fate. This skill seemed to shine strongly in Percy if his demigod dreams were anything to go off. Overall, this made Poseidon a dangerous opponent that would need to be handled carefully if I was to avoid gaining the ire of the ancient sea god. The unpredictable nature of his domain was reflected strongly in his personality, which left me on edge, considering the certainty and stability of my domain, which opposed each other. These thoughts were abruptly stopped when his physical form finally came to completion. It was exactly like I expected, standing at a similar height to myself of 10 feet, with a form that rippled with bulging muscle. His skin was deeply tanned like he spent his days lounging around on the beach sunbathing, and his features were proud and noble with a sharp and powerful jaw and a nose that looked unbreakable. His hair was long and untamed like the sea. It flowed down behind his shoulders and contained the same dark coloring of our mother. His beard was well kept yet was longer than mine. The jewel on the crown, however, was a set of sea-green eyes that swirled with power and reflected the mood of the sea. In conclusion, he was handsome, with the sea-green glow that seemed to outline his form and the smell of sea mist that lingered in his presence. I had no issue believing that this was the god of the sea. Once Poseidon had entered his physical form, he summoned a chitin of seaweed and ocean flora and a crown made of coral and seashells, as if his looks weren't already enough for you to figure out who he was. I knew I'd have to deal with Poseidon differently than my other siblings. In the cases of Hestia and Demeter, the introductions were done on my terms, not theirs. If I were to try to do the same to Poseidon, it might give off an aura of dominance, something I most certainly do not want Poseidon to think I'm trying to do on our first meeting. So, I instead decided to watch from a distance as he became aware of his surroundings, being able to view him as he came to terms with the essence of his domains. Watching his eyes flicker quickly from raging storms to cooling waters as he considered his domain. Instead of beginning to introduce himself to our siblings as I expected he would do, Poseidon turned tail and marched straight to the flowing cave river, stopping only momentarily to eye it inquisitively before his eyes came alive in a bright sea-green light and his divine power burst from his being in an ocean of green mist that spread across the surface of the river. The nearby naiads, their beautiful features all seemed to freeze in a mixture of awe and terror before diving deep beneath the river's surface. Face filled with determination, Poseidon began marching straight into its depths. Each step he took, the bright sea-green glow that surrounded his body seemed to grow in power, until he was no longer visible beneath its currents. From time to time, the smell of sea salt and a flash of green light would erupt from the river, but no naiads or Poseidon would rise from its depths. Deciding I had spent enough time gawking at the river, I returned to Hestia's hearth to continue waiting for Hera. After all, it probably wouldn't be a brilliant idea to march in the river after Poseidon. Who knows what sort of things he's doing down there. 11 comments 0 vote. The goddess who would be queen. Hades Pav. Plenty of time had passed since Poseidon's retreat beneath the depths of the river when I had spent conversing with Hestia. Although she had spent the entirety of her life since her birth trapped inside her father's belly, she was a keen conversationalist, and being the goddess of the hearth and family, it made any conversations between us relatively smooth going. And while I would have loved to continue getting to know Demeter, she had already run deeper into the cave, most likely to converse with the local nymphs and dryads. This train of thought came to an abrupt end when I caught the sight of Hera's physical body finally coming towards its completion. While I may have found the idea of spending so long on a form that you can change at any time to be a bit foolish, it was time well spent in her case. Being the patron of women and the future queen of the heavens left me with high expectations regarding Hera's physical appearance. After all, being a goddess so beautiful that Zeus, the famous womanizer himself, was willing to trip over himself to get her to marry him, he did set the bar pretty high. It was stated that before the arrival of Aphrodite, Hera was the most beautiful being in creation. Now, I'm not sure if that is true, because if it is, I don't think I can blame the entirety of Olympus for almost breaking out into civil war to be with her. Because Hera was the definition of perfection, with a form that barely reached 8 feet tall and a body that was the very definition of womanhood, wide childbearing hips, and a busty figure, yet hidden almost unnoticeably was a lining of muscle along her arms and legs, with beautiful white almost marble-like skin that radiated with golden glow of a goddess divinity. Hers was the type of beauty kings warred for and men killed for. Merely gazing upon her could cause one to fall into an infatuated lust. And that was before you reached her features, her face a canvas of an untouchable perfected beauty that sang with regality. Enchanting blood-like red lips lay beneath her soft nose, upturned just slightly in an arrogant smirk. Shiny black hair woven with threads of gold and silver cascaded past her collarbone and down behind her back. Like all gods, it was her eyes that genuinely drew one's attention, and hers were no different, with an iris that was like a peacock tail flushed with a variety of colors, from emerald green to electric blue. Their pupils, however, they contained a warm brown that held a softness to them that one could be trapped in. Overall, perfection no longer felt fitting for describing such a being. Once Hera was finally done with her creation, a gorgeous white summer dress was conjured upon her form, decorated full of green and blue jewels as well as peacock feathers that clung to both the dress sleeves and skirt. Upon her brow sat a glistening gold crown that had tales of the past, present and future engraved upon it. Everything about her screamed nobility, like she was chosen by creation to become queen. Hera took a moment to gather her bearings before quickly striding towards the hearth with mighty footsteps. When she arrived just shy of where Hestia and I sat, she placed one hand over the other before giving a short courtesy with all the grace of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Rising from the bow to gaze curiously between Hestia and me before being seemingly satisfied with whatever it was she was looking for, she quickly completed the last few steps that separated her and as to delicately place herself down next to us, with all the manners and etiquette that befitted a noble heiress. Turning quickly to me, her lips lifted, in what I can only assume was an attempt at a warm smile but instead came out like a slight grimace. She spoke in a voice that contained both softness and aura of authority. "So you are my siblings, yes?" It was stated like a question, yet the knowledge of what her domains were and the obviousness of it all alerted me to the fact it was said out of politeness and a way to break the ice. Realizing if I spent too long thinking of a way to reply, I strained my grave voice again, that a prickly goddess like Hera would probably take offense. "You would be correct." Following that statement, I released an awkward offering of my hand, the kind given after the end of a job interview that had gone poorly. Taking pity on my below-standard social skills, Hera allowed a teasing smirk to grace her face before quickly closing the gap between us in a fierce hug. Before I had time to compute that Hera, the wrathful goddess of the heavens, was giving me a hug of all things, she quickly retreated, wearing the same smirk she entered the embrace with. "Do not worry, brother, a few thousand years surrounded by me and we'll have you speaking full sentences." The way she said it to most would have probably been seen as insulting, especially if they were a near all-powerful deity. Still, the soft, teasing smirk that remained on her face throughout the entire conversation alerted me to the playful intentions behind it. Responding only with a slight smirk and tip of the head, Hera spent the rest of the conversation telling me about the wonders of marriage and how I wouldn't have to worry as big sis Hera would make sure I'd have a great marriage. This train of conversation led me to quickly look for an escape, which came in the form of a Hestia-shaped missile striking Hera from the side. With the power of hugs as well as their shared domains, Hera and Hestia got on like a house on fire, talking about the wonders of family. However, I did see the grimace that entered my usually happy-go-lucky sister's face when Hera brought up marriage. Hera didn't, however, and continued to tell my sister how happy she would be with whatever guy she'd set her up with. Deciding it was time, I did my significant brother's duty and intervened, only to be cut off by booming thunder. Quickly lifting my eyes to the sky, Poseidon came rushing out of the water with a start, and Demeter came running back from wherever she'd gotten off. An eagle, white with a beak of pure gold, released cause of warning before rapidly descending upon the cave. The eagle's cawing ended when it landed on the cave floor just a few feet away, looking around with unnerving intelligence. The sound of roaring thunder and raging winds was our only warning before standing in the eagle's place. It was the form of a man just as tall and built as myself and Poseidon. 45 comments 0 vote. Tales from the Titanomachy. Part 1. Unknown author. Modern Times Pav. On the island of Crete, a tearful Rhea would greet her newly freed children. After a cheerful reunion, a council of the gods that would be dubbed the Olympian Council by Zeus would be swiftly formed, consisting of all the Cronides as well as Métis and Rhea. Despite initial resistance from Poseidon, the council would vote for Zeus as their leader. A unanimous vote would be cast to wage war against their tyrannical father. Overnight, the cosmos erupted into conflict, the forces that made up creation warred among themselves. Sea versus sky and light against dark, concepts such as death and time battled for superiority, and the immortal world once more fell into chaos. For the first time since the war between the protogonoi, the order of creation was broken. Zeus and his brother Poseidon joined forces to create storms made from both the sea and sky to ravage Gaia, leveling mountains and bringing destruction to the lesser titans. Hades, with his connection to the underworld, summoned the walls of Erebus, the ever-expanding walls of the underworld, to enshroud Gaia in a fog of darkness, a fog so thick that not even the light of Helios could pierce its boundaries. With her dominion over agriculture and seasons, Demeter culled the world in a heavy winter that rotted all life from Gaia. Hera and Hestia, despite their more pacifistic divinities, proved invaluable in drawing allies to the Olympians, cuz titans such as Helios, Selene, and the goddess Styx would swiftly join the gods in rebellion after the goddess's persuasion. The twin children of Hyperion would be valuable allies, holding control over the celestial bodies that orbited Gaia and made the gods more aware of the titans' actions. For their support, Zeus made them members of his newly formed Olympian Council. And while the goddess Styx may have been bound to the underworld and Tartarus, her 4 immortal children were not. Zeleus the Zeal, Nike the Victorious, Kratos the Strength, and Bia the Force became a part of Zeus' honor guard, capable warriors as well as attendants. In gratitude, Zeus would make Styx the keeper of oaths to honor her. With the element of surprise on their side, the gods made quick work of any of the titans' initial resistance. From their headquarters of Mount Ida, Crete, the gods would make significant gains along the coast of what would today be considered Greece and Turkey and seize control over a lot of the Aegean islands. However, despite the overwhelming might of the Olympians and their allies, their initial success would quickly grind to a halt. The experience and numbers that the titans held and the cunning and power of Kronos would prove more than a catch for the Olympians. While Hades' shroud would block the gods from the titans' gaze, Kronos' control of time made taking the titans by surprise nearly impossible. Even with the desertion of the younger titans and the neutrality of the Sea King Oceanus, toppling the titans' dominion over creation was proving to be far more complicated than the gods first believed. Through the strategies of Métis and the versatility of the nature spirits, the gods were forced into a state of guerrilla warfare, with clashes between the gods and titans being few and far between. The Battle of Rhodes would find a clash between the 3 sons of Kronos and the titans' general Atlas. Despite their superior power and numbers, the gods' pride would take a mighty blow when they were forced off the field by a far more experienced Atlas. Zeus would be especially inflamed after having his physical form gravely wounded by Atlas's spear. This battle would show that while the gods were prestigious in their might, that didn't make up for thousands of years of experience. It was only through the intervention of Helios, the sun god, that the gods would make a successful retreat. The aftermath of this battle would see the gods far more careful in their deployment in the field of battle, deciding to use their power to manipulate creation to wipe out their enemies from afar rather than engaging in single combat. This decision would prove to be wise during the Battle of Lemnos. Here, the titan Krios would find himself at the end of Hades' shadows. While Krios is the titan of stars and constellations and the lord of the south, he is arguably the weakest of his brothers, and his temporary defeat had little to no effect on the war effort as a whole. The defeat of one of the elder titans, however, did wonders for the gods' morale. In conclusion, the beginning stages of the Titanomachy were both slow and grueling, with a variety of minor conflicts emerging within a far greater clash of the concepts of the world. The longer the war went on, the stronger the gods became, and with more experience and control over their divinities, the weaker and less influential the titans became over their own. A victory for the gods was almost a guarantee. Of course, with his control over time, a being like Kronos could foresee this and try everything in his power to curb the gods' growth by attempting to meet them in battle and damaging their domains. Despite this, the gods were wise enough not to try yet to challenge their father so directly. Kronos' fearsome strength and cursed side were still feared across existence, and even the ancient protogonoi thought twice before challenging him, so despite how much they wished, the gods were forced to flee at the sight of their father. Even the hot-tempered Poseidon's spirit was culled at the sight of his raging father. Unfortunately, the Titanomachy would prove disastrous for Gaia. The constant clash of the forces of nature would severely damage the world. Prometheus, the titan of forethought, and Themis, the titaness of divine law, justice, and fairness, would see the Titanomachy's damage on the creation and remove their neutrality to join the Olympians. This act would be the deciding factor of the Titanomachy, as Prometheus would alert Zeus to his imprisoned uncles, the Cyclops and Hecatonkers, in the depths of Tartarus and their great strength and legendary forging abilities. With this knowledge, Zeus and his brothers would begin their journey into Tartarus to free their monstrous uncles. Marching through the gates of hell. Hades POV. The beginning of the Titanomachy was going about as I expected. We had the raw firepower to overpower the Titans, but none of the experience or numbers that would have made such an act possible. What the war was good for, however, was using my newfound power. Feeling the divine energy beneath your skin was far different from releasing it on a bunch of lesser deities. Few things were as satisfying as watching entire landscapes be reformed under your power. If not for my humbling against Atlas, I'd probably have gotten lost in my power. Managing to scatter Creo's essence temporarily was an opportunity I hadn't seen coming, but my progress in manipulating Erebus was far better than what I initially believed. As the god of the dead in a time before mortal life existed, my powers were quite limited, so discovering that despite not yet ruling the underworld, I could still manipulate the darkness of Erebus was a significant boost to my combat abilities. Overall, the war growing to a standstill did wonders for developing my and my siblings' power. With each battle, our control and connection to our domains grew more potent, so when the time came when Prometheus and Themis defected to our side, I was pretty put down, considering it would signify the end of the war. I also knew from my previous life that it would begin our journey down into Tartarus. Tartarus was the eternal pit of misery and abyss, the prison of eternal torment that even the mightiest immortals feared. In ancient myth, it was reserved primarily for the enemies of the gods and the titans that allied with Kronos. It is said that Tartarus was as far beneath the underworld as the underworld was to Olympus, and that even Olympians themselves, at the height of their power, would avoid its fiery depths if they could. This was because Tartarus was the physical manifestation of the eldest son of Gaia and the father of the future defeater of Zeus, Typhon, the father of monsters, and the Gigantes, or God's bane. Because Tartarus was neutral towards the Olympians at the best of times and outright hostile on some occasions, and the fact that most of the gods' domains would be severely limited so far beneath the surface, it seemed only right that the gods would avoid such a place. So, when Prometheus and all his wisdom came rolling up to Zeus and telling him wondrous stories of our uncle's monstrous strength, I should have felt an overwhelming sense of dread and anxiety. But whether it be due to my connection to the underworld and divinity over the dead, the prospect of venturing deep beneath the earth and into what was the most horrifying plane of existence filled me with curiosity and excitement. After all, as the future king of the underworld, the only known permanent entrance to Tartarus would be through my realm, so it was only fitting I had a natural affinity towards the terrifying hellscape. Luckily enough for us, while I may not yet be the ruler of the underworld, my connection to the realm, mixed with my dominion over all precious metals that existed beneath the earth, meant that knowledge of the underworld's location and how to navigate it was ingrained into my being. This meant what should have been a far more treacherous journey was shortened into a casual act of shadow travel. I had always been envious of the calmness and strength my brothers gained by being inside their domains, so when we first arrived in the underworld, a sense of rightness filled my being as well as a jaw-dropping power-up that seemed ridiculous when you consider my already overwhelming strength. The landscape of the underworld itself was nothing special, filled with bland fields of gray grass, cloudy skies of red blood, and a large gaping wound in its shadowy walls for the entrance of Tartarus. It wouldn't be winning any beauty awards. Although, to be fair, unlike the other realms, the underworld had no previous ruler, and very few beings were willing to call it home, so there was little development done, something I would be sure to change when I eventually became king. Due to the nature of the underworld being corrosive and possessive of the beings that resided within its boundaries, much of our time there was spent with me maintaining a cloak of shadows over my brothers as we made our way to the doors of death. Despite my best efforts, I wasn't yet the underworld's ruler and, as such, couldn't completely protect my brothers from its torments. Poseidon especially fared poorly under the underworld's harsh gaze, being so far from the sea had caused his form to age rapidly. Gone was the handsome young man, and in its place a frail older man with dull green eyes and long white hair. At the same time, Zeus seemed to be able to maintain his strength. I could tell being unable to feel his connection to the sky had troubled him. Fortunately for my siblings, our trip through Erebus would come to an end when we reached the glowing red doors of death. As a god of the dead, the pungent smell of rotting flesh and the discomforting warmth that flowed from the door hardly affected me. My brothers, however, seemed to grow even worse as white strands of hair began to form on Zeus' once ebony locks and Poseidon seemed to struggle to breathe. From the envious and slightly fearful looks I was receiving from my siblings, I take a serene smile, isn't the most usual reaction to seeing the door to literally hell. However, while many criticisms could be given to my brother's cowards, they were not as with one gulp of acidic air and a tightening of his fists, Zeus began to march towards the doors of death, and with quick and mighty strides, he would be swiftly followed by a wheezing Poseidon. Deciding that, seen as though I was the only one with any ability to navigate Tartarus, it would be wise if I led our way. Not that my brothers put up much of a protest. After all, if we did come into contact with any monsters, it would be me they'd see first. Tartarus was hard to describe. The entire place smelt of rotten flesh and old gym socks, and a sulfuric taste lingered on your tongue, making even our divine bodies struggle to breathe. The walls and floor were made of a pasty flesh-like material, while the sky was a copper-colored mist. The entire realm seemed to beat like a heart, a steady reminder for all who entered that they now navigated the body of Tartarus. Despite my initial excitement, even I was beginning to be worn down by the oppressive nature of the abyss. The less said about my brothers, the better. Thankfully, the elder Cyclops and Hecatonchires were very loud in their response to torture, making following their location far more accessible than it would have been otherwise. Following the thundering wails of our monstrous uncles, we found ourselves at the foot of a large mountain that seemed to be a perfect replica of Mount Othrys. The further we made our way up the mountain, the louder the wails became until they were nearly deafening. The sight of our 6 uncles chained against colossal pillars was what greeted us at the peak. Standing a few yards away from her prisoners was Camp, a vile creature made from the twisted mind of Kronos to torture his uncles. Standing at half the height of the Cyclops and barely reached the knees of the Hecatonchires, what the creature lost in height it gained in its frightful features, with the upper body of a grotesque woman with hair made from serpents, a scorpion's tail, 50 heads of different ferocious beasts and black feathered wings, she caused even me and my brothers unease. Logically, we knew she was no match for us. Even our uncles would have been able to deal with her if not for Kronos' spines, but the idea of facing such a creature was still not something to look forward to. Especially with my brothers so far away from their places of power. As I turned to my brothers to begin to formulate a plan, I saw a spark of fire light beneath Zeus' eyes before, with a charming smile and a cocky look in his eyes, he spoke, "Worry not, brothers. I will deal with Camp while you focus on freeing our uncles." Before either of us could react, Zeus disappeared in a burst of wind, followed by a haunting roar as heavy footsteps rapidly rang through our ears. Looking over from the rock we had hidden behind, we saw both Camp and Zeus nowhere to be seen, while our uncles had constipated looks on their faces. Deciding not to wait around, I quickly left to start shattering the chains that bound our uncles, gaining slurred words of thank you mixed in with a sob now and then. As Poseidon freed the last of the Cyclops, booming thunder rang across Tartarus as a black dot in the sky quickly turned into a camp-shaped blob that crashed mere feet away from our position and nearly took us off. Once the dust cleared, we were treated to the view of a particularly proud-looking Zeus. As the once proud and feared torture of the eldest children of Oranos and Gaia quickly faded into gold dust, the cocky smile of Zeus became full-blown as our uncles seemed to start muttering in awe. "So, what are your thoughts on Rebellion's uncles?"